The wind in the Ashwind Range didn't just bite, it gnawed. It was a late autumn cold that felt like a judgment, promising a winter that would bury the high country in 20 feet of snow before Christmas. The sky was the color of a dull slate, heavy and low, pressing down on the peaks. Calder Boone, 19 years old and possessing little more than the clothes on his back and a Hawken rifle that had seen better days, knew that wind. He felt it in the hollows of his stomach. He was a drifter, pushed west by circumstance and kept moving by the lack of any reason to stop. He lived on what he could trap, mostly marten and rabbit, and what he could trade for in the sparse, suspicious settlements hunched in the valleys. He worked quickly, his breath pluming in the frigid air, gathering brittle, dry pine branches. His shelter wasn't much, just a scrap of canvas tarp, torn and patched with flour sacking, stretched between two boulders and a stunted pine. It was a miserable defense against the coming night, but it was his. He focused on the task, his knuckles already raw and blue, his mind fixed on one thing: fire. Fire meant surviving the night. Lack of fire meant waking up stiff, or not waking up at all. That's when he heard it. It wasn't a scream. It was a thin, high sound, almost like a bird caught in a snare, nearly swallowed by the constant moan of the wind. He froze. Every instinct, honed by months of solitude and near starvation, screamed at him. Sound meant trouble. Sound meant a competitor for his trap lines, or a grizzly, or worse, other men. He listened again. There it was, a low cry, choked off. It came from a jagged cleft of rock 50 yards below his camp, where the mountain fell away into a steep gorge filled with scree. Calder dropped the armload of wood. He moved slowly, his worn boots making almost no sound on the thin dusting of new snow. He eased his rifle from his shoulder, checking the cap with his thumb. He peered over the ledge. She was half wedged between two granite teeth, her body twisted. She wasn't a settler. Her dress was worn buckskin, beaded in a pattern he didn't recognize, and her black hair was matted with snow and dirt. She looked about his age, maybe 19, perhaps 20. She was trying to pull herself free, but one leg was trapped. He saw the blood first, a dark, ugly stain spreading from her calf, melting the snow in a sickening crimson smear. She had a leather pouch clutched to her chest, her knuckles white, holding it like it was the only thing left in the world. Calder's gut clenched. He knew who she was. Tawny. His first thought was to walk away, turn around, go back to his camp, and pretend he'd heard nothing. Survival depended on minding your own business, and getting involved with the local tribes was the fastest way to find yourself on the wrong end of a misunderstanding. The army was jumpy, the settlers were terrified, and the tribes were being squeezed. It was a powder keg, and she was a lit fuse. He stayed frozen, hidden by the overhang, his mind racing. He knew what trouble looked like. He knew the sharp, metallic smell of it. Then he remembered. The memory hit him, sharp and unwanted, like a sudden cramp from the cold. He remembered Silas Kincaid. He remembered the smell of the ink on the foreclosure papers, thick and self-righteous. He remembered Kincaid's voice, smooth as oiled steel, explaining how the interest in the loan notes meant his family's small farm was no longer theirs. Calder had been 16. He'd watched as Kincaid's hired men, wearing badges bought and paid for, had thrown his mother's possessions into the mud. Kincaid hadn't used a gun. Not directly. He'd used paper. He'd used the law like a club. And the result was the same. His father was broken, and his mother was dead before the first frost. Calder looked down at the girl. He saw the same look in her eyes he'd seen in his father's, the look of being trapped, cornered by a fate that didn't play fair. He swore, a quiet, bitter curse that fogged in front of his face. He slid his rifle back onto his shoulder and started climbing down the rocks. She saw him. Her eyes widened, not with relief, but with sharp terror. She tried to scramble backward, ignoring the pain, and let out a sharp hiss. "Easy," Calder said, his voice rough. He kept his hands open, away from his rifle. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." He reached her. The gash was bad. It was deep, torn open on the sharp edge of the granite, running from just below her knee halfway down her calf. It was bleeding sluggishly, but it was deep enough to show bone. She watched him, her breathing fast and shallow, her hand still clamped tight on the leather pouch. "That's gonna need closing," he said, more to himself. He shrugged off his thin pack and knelt. He didn't have much, some sinew, a needle, but no time for that. Not here. He looked at his own canvas jacket, then at the flannel shirt beneath it. It was his last good shirt. He grunted, pulled the hem, and ripped a long, wide strip from the bottom. She flinched when he reached for her leg. "Hold still," he ordered, his voice flat. "This is gonna hurt." He folded the cloth into a thick pad and pressed it hard into the wound. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and her fingers dug into the rock. "Hold it," he said. "Press it. Hard." He used the rest of the strip to wrap the makeshift bandage, pulling the knot brutally tight. It wouldn't hold long, but it might stop her from bleeding out. "Can you stand?" she tried. She pushed herself up, her face pale and slick with sweat. But the moment she put weight on the leg, she collapsed with a gasp. The sky was getting darker, the wind was picking up, and the first hard flakes of the real storm were beginning to drive. "Hell," Calder muttered. He looked up toward his camp. It was impossible. He looked west, toward the pass. He made a decision. "We gotta move. We stay here. We freeze." He bent down, slipping one arm under her knees and the other around her back. He lifted. She was light, all sinew and bone, but she was still a burden. She wrapped her free arm around his neck, her hand grabbing a fistful of his jacket. He felt the warmth of her cheek brush his ear as he adjusted her weight. The climb back up the scree was agonizing. He slipped twice, his boots finding no purchase on the loose. Snow-slicked rock. Each jolt sent a tremor of pain through her, and he could feel her wince, hear her breath hitch. But she made no sound. His own lungs burned. The air was thin and sharp as glass. Their breath mingled. A single, frantic white cloud in the graying light. He reached the relative flat of the ridge and didn't stop. He pushed past his own meager camp, heading west. "Where?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Ravenstep Pass." He grunted. "There's a trader's road, maybe a wagon. We can't stay here." He felt her stiffen. She pushed weakly against his chest. "No, Ravenstep. Must get Ravenstep before night." Her English was broken, thick with an accent he couldn't place. "We're going," he said, shifting her weight. "Gonna take a few hours. That snow's setting in." "No, before night," she insisted, her voice gaining a strange, desperate strength. "The winter promise. If not, it breaks. It breaks." Calder didn't know what a winter promise was, but he knew panic. The storm hit them then. A sudden wall of white. The wind shrieked, driving ice pellets that stung his exposed face. Within minutes, he couldn't see 10 feet. The path was gone. His camp was gone. Ravenstep Pass was an impossibility. They were going to die. He stumbled, turning his back to the wind, looking for any landmark. He saw a dark shape, a massive overhanging drift that had been carved out by the wind, forming a shallow hollow against a rock face, a snow cave. He plunged into it, collapsing into the powdery drift, shielding her with his body. The sudden silence was deafening. The wind howled over them, but inside the small space, it was just the sound of their own harsh breathing. He set her down gently, propping her against the rock. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering in a rhythm that scared him. It was the deep chill, the one that stole the life from you. "Fire," he said, his own voice shaking. "Need fire." He fumbled in his pack, his fingers numb, clumsy as blocks of wood. He pulled out his flint and steel, and a small tin of tinder dry moss and a tallow-soaked rag. He chipped at the flint, the sparks dying uselessly in the cold. His hands were shaking too hard. "Damn it," he hissed. He saw her watching him, her dark eyes huge in the gloom. She was still clutching the leather pouch. He looked at it, then at her. He made no move toward it. He turned back to his task, shielding the tinder with his body, forcing his hands to be still. Finally, a spark caught. It glowed orange on the char cloth. He bent his head, blowing gently, coaxing it. The tinder smoked, then flared. He fed it tiny twigs he'd kept in his pocket, nursing the flame, building it with a desperate, tender care. A small, weak fire crackled to life, casting a flickering, inadequate light in their tiny refuge. He looked at her. She was huddled, her arms wrapped around herself, but the shivering wouldn't stop. Her skin was a pale, waxy color. He edged closer, holding his raw hands over the flame, trying to get some feeling back into them. He then moved, sitting directly beside her, shoulder to shoulder. "Your hands," he said. She looked at him, confused. "Give me your hands." She hesitated. Her eyes searched his, looking for something. He didn't know what. He just held his own out, palms up. They were rough, scarred from traps and knives. Slowly, she uncurled her fingers from the pouch and placed her hands in his. They were like ice. He wrapped his larger, rougher hands around hers, trapping them. He rubbed, trying to force warmth back into her skin. It was an awkward, intimate gesture, driven by pure necessity. He felt the delicate bones, the shocking cold. She didn't pull away. She just watched him, her breathing still rattling. They sat like that for a long time as the fire fought against the cold and the wind howled outside. Their eyes met over their joined hands. There was no language between them, just a silent, raw acknowledgement. He saw hesitation. He saw a profound, desperate gratitude. And she, in his eyes, saw a weariness that matched her own. The storm broke as suddenly as it had come. The wind died down to a low moan. Calder knew they couldn't stay. The cold in the cave was worse than the wind. "We have to move," he said, releasing her hands. They were warmer. He helped her up, carrying her again. They pushed on through the knee-deep drifts. The world was a fresh, blinding white. It took them another hour to reach the Copper Lantern Crossing, a shallow ford where the river flattened out. It was choked with slush ice, the water running black and fast. He didn't hesitate. He hitched her higher on his chest and stepped in. The water was a physical blow, a pain so intense it stole his breath. It surged past his knees, soaking his trousers instantly, freezing them to his legs. He grit his teeth, forcing one foot in front of the other, fighting the current that tried to pull them under. He stumbled on a slick rock, and she gasped, clinging to him. But he found his footing and pushed on. They collapsed on the far bank, both shaking. But the trees were thicker here. They were close. He carried her for another 20 minutes until they reached the edge of a dark, dense forest of black pine. She stirred, tapping his shoulder. "Here," she whispered. He set her down. She leaned against a tree, testing her injured leg. She couldn't stand on it, but she seemed to know where she was. She pointed through the trees. In the far distance, barely visible, Calder could see a thin gray tendril of smoke rising against the darkening sky. "Ravenstep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Home." She turned back to him. The light was almost gone, but he could see her face clearly. She fumbled with the leather pouch, her fingers stiff. She pulled out the amulet. It was a piece of bone, carved smooth and pale, shaped like a crescent moon. It seemed to hum with a strange coldness. She reached for his wrist. He instinctively pulled back. "No," she said, her voice firm. She grabbed his hand. "You walked the path. The path must know you." Before he could protest, she tied the leather thong securely around his wrist. The bone amulet rested heavy against his skin. A sound echoed through the trees. A man's voice, calling out in a language Calder had never heard, sharp and guttural. Sania's head snapped up. She answered. A single, clear call. She looked back at Calder. Her face was impossible to read in the gloom. There was no smile, but the fear was gone. She held his gaze for one long second, then turned, using the trees for support. She dragged herself into the shadows of the forest, disappearing into the black timber as silently as a ghost. Calder stood alone, the amulet burning cold on his wrist. He was soaked, freezing, and exhausted. He waited, listening to the faint sounds of her retreat, then turned and began the long, agonizing limp back to his camp. He didn't make it. He found a dry spot under a pine, used his fire-starting skills again, and spent a miserable, shivering night, drifting in and out of a shallow, cold sleep. When the first thin gray light of dawn touched the snow, he forced his stiff limbs to move. He stumbled back to his ridge, his only thought to get to his tarp, his few belongings, and the rest of his dry wood. He crested the last rise and stopped, his blood turning to ice. His camp was there, his pitiful tarp, his small stack of wood, his cold fire pit, and surrounding it, standing as still and silent as the granite boulders they hid behind, were 30 tawny warriors. They were not moving. They were simply watching him. They held lances tipped with black stone, and longbows that looked strong enough to send a shaft through a buffalo. They wore furs and hides, their faces painted in lines of black and white, their eyes fixed on him, expressionless. They had materialized from the snow, as if the mountain itself had given birth to them. Calder Boone stood alone on the ridge, the crescent-shaped amulet heavy on his wrist, and realized the trouble he had tried so hard to avoid had finally found him. The silence on the ridge was absolute. It was heavier than the snow-laden clouds, more profound than the cold. Calder's heart hammered against his ribs. A frantic bird in a small cage. He kept his hands open, away from his rifle, away from the knife at his belt. He was one man, and they were 30. Any move, any breath, would be his last. The warriors parted, their movements fluid and economical, creating a path through their ranks. A man stepped forward. He was older, but not old. His face was a map of hard lines, carved by wind and authority. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than Calder, and wore a heavy buffalo robe over his buckskins. His black hair, streaked with iron gray, was bound in 2 long braids. But it was his eyes that held Calder captive. They were sharp, intelligent, and held no malice, only an unnerving, bottomless assessment. He stopped 10 feet from Calder. The wind moved the eagle feather tied in his hair, but the man himself was as still as the mountain. When he spoke, his voice was a low baritone, and the English was perfect, clipped with the precision of a scholar rather than the broken speech of a trader. "You carried my daughter across the mountain." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that hung in the frozen air. Calder swallowed, his throat dry. "She was hurt. She would have frozen. Sania is her name." The man said, "I am Dakota Greywind. Her father." He took another step. "You did what a man should. The mountain thanks you. My family thanks you." Calder nodded, a jerky, uncertain movement. This was not the attack he had braced for. "But," Dakota continued, his voice hardening just slightly, "a debt has been created. You touched her life. You saved it. Now the path demands you." Cauldron's eyes darted left and right. The warriors hadn't moved. They were statues, their dark eyes watching his every flicker. "Demands me I don't want any trouble. I just want to get my things and move on, before the snow gets too deep." Dakota smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Move on." He gestured with his chin. The warriors to Calder's right stepped aside. Calder's breath caught, where his camp had been. His meager belongings were stacked with meticulous care. His bedroll was tightly lashed. His small cast-iron skillet was clean. His spare traps were bundled. His tarp, the one he had slept under, was folded into a neat square. But that wasn't what seized his attention. The snow around his camp was a churned-up mess of hoof prints. Not just from a few ponies, but from dozens. They had been here all night. They had surrounded him while he shivered and slept, watching him, and he had never known. They could have taken his rifle, his knife, his life, with less effort than it took to breathe. He looked back at Dakota, a new, colder fear settling in. They hadn't just found him. They had allowed him to wake up. "You searched my camp," Calder said, his voice quiet. "We confirmed you were alone." Dakota corrected him. We confirmed you were what you seemed to be, a man with nothing. Running from a hard past, we took nothing. We are not thieves. Dakota's gaze dropped to Calder's left wrist. You carry the skybone. Calder instinctively moved to cover the amulet with his other hand. She gave it to me, he said quickly. A charm, for the path. It is not a charm, Dakota said, his voice dropping, taking on a resonant, formal quality. It is the winter passage, the sacred oath. He held up his own left hand. On his wrist was a leather thong, but the amulet was gone. The one you carry is mine. The one my daughter was tasked to return to our people before the first true snow. The one that means truce. As he spoke, every warrior, as one, brought his right hand up to lay flat against his chest, over his heart. It was a salute, a sign of profound reverence, all directed at the small, pale crescent of bone on Calder's arm. Calder felt dizzy. He had stumbled into something far bigger than a lost girl. It allows safe passage, Dakota explained, seeing the confusion on Calder's face. It is the promise, carved in the bone of the sky beast, that the Tawny will not raise a hand against the salt traders from the southern flats, and they will not raise a hand against us. It is the only reason our people survive the deep winter, when the game is scarce and the salt is life. He paused, and his face darkened. And now, that promise is broken. A murmur went through the warriors, a low, angry sound like stones grinding together. I don't understand, Calder said. She's safe. I have the amulet. The promise isn't broken. The amulet is safe, Dakota said, his eyes like flint. But the truce is shattered. 2 nights ago, the salt depot at Thistle Creek was burned to the ground. 20 barrels of salt, gone. 2 traders, dead. And the men who did it, they carried lances painted with tawny colors. They let 1 man escape, to ride to Fort Wallace and tell the soldiers the Tawny had broken the winter passage. Calder felt the trap closing. But it wasn't you. Of course it was not us, a younger warrior to Dakota's left snapped, his hand tightening on his lance. Dakota raised a hand, and the man fell silent. His nostrils flared. It was a lie, Dakota said, his voice calm again, but lethal. A lie told with fire and blood. A lie to bring the cavalry down from the fort. A lie to clear the mountains. He needed no more explanation. Calder had seen this story before. It was the same story, told over and over, with different names. Someone wanted the land. Someone wanted what was under it. And they would use any tool law, or lies, or lead to get it. The soldiers will not listen to us, Dakota said. They see our skin, and they see the smoke. They do not look for the man who lit the match. They only look for the man to hang. We must go to Thistle Creek. We must speak to the townsfolk, to the traders who know us. But if we ride in 30 strong, they will see in war party. They will shoot first. He looked Calder dead in the eye. They need to see a white face, a face they do not know. A man who is not from the fort, not from the trading companies. A ghost white, someone who can walk in, tell our story, and be heard. Calgater took a step back. No, I can't. I'm no one. I'm just a trapper. They won't listen to me. I'm not getting in the middle of a fight with the army. I won't. You are already in the middle. Dakota said simply, You carry the skybone. You are the man who brought my daughter home. Your story is now tied to ours. What's in it for me? Calder asked, his voice coming out harder than he intended. I saved your daughter. You've searched my camp. Seems to me, we're even. Even. Dakota's gaze swept over Calder's torn jacket, his worn-out boots, his pathetic shelter. You have no food for a week. Your traps are thin. This winter will kill you. You know it. I know it. He made his offer. Ride with us. Be our voice. You will have a lodge in our winter camp, safe from the snows. You will eat from our stores. We will give you a horse, a real one, not that swayback mule you lost last month. Calder flinched. They knew everything. A horse and shelter, Dakota finished. And you will see the spring, refuse, and we will leave you here, to the mountain, as we found you. The dread of it settled on Calder, cold and heavy. It wasn't just the fear of the warriors. Who could kill him where he stood? It was the fear of the coming conflict. He knew what happened when the army got involved, when the word massacre started getting whispered. He wanted no part of it. He wanted to be invisible. And then, that memory, the one he always pushed down, rose up, sharp and suffocating. He wasn't on the mountain. He was 16 again, standing in the muddy yard of his family's farm. He could smell the damp wool of Silas Kincaid's fine suit. He could smell the acrid ink from the stack of contracts Kincaid held. He remembered the cold, polished steel of the pistol on Kincaid's hip, a pistol he never had to draw because his words did the work. "It's just business, son," Kincaid had said, his voice smooth and reasonable. While his men carried out the furniture, "Your father made a bargain. He signed the paper. The note came due. This land is forfeit." Calder had looked at the papers. They were a blizzard of fine print, of clauses and addendums he couldn't understand. But he understood the signature. He understood the boot prints in his mother's vegetable garden. "It's thievery." Calder had spat. Kincaid had smiled, a small, reptilian smile. "It's the law, boy. Learn the difference." Now, standing on the snow-swept ridge, Calder saw it. It was the same game. Kincaid, with his contracts and his lawyers, and these unknown men, with their false flags and their burned-out depot. They were starting a war with paper and lies, so the army could finish it with lead. They were clearing the board. And he, Calder Boone, was being offered a choice: be a victim, again, or pick a side. He let out a long breath, the fog of it obscuring Dakota's face for a moment. He thought of the girl, of her hand in his, of that desperate, defiant look in her eyes. He met Dakota's gaze. "I owe your daughter," he said, his voice steady for the first time. "And I owe myself." He nodded. "Once. I'll do it." A ripple of relief passed through the warriors. The tension that had held them rigid as iron bars finally eased. "You have chosen well. Calder Boone," Dakota said. He turned his head toward the line of black pines. "Sania, it is safe." Calder's head snapped toward the forest. He hadn't seen her. She emerged from the trees, moving with a limp, but with a grace that defied it. She was dressed in fresh, dry buckskins. The gash on her leg had been cleaned and was now stitched tight with what looked like fine sinew, the work neat and practiced. She stopped a few feet from him. Her eyes were clear, the fear and pain of the night before gone, replaced by a quiet, appraising look. She searched his face, and he saw a small, almost imperceptible smile touch the corners of her mouth. It was a fragile thing, but it lit her face. A bond had been forged in that snow cave, in that silent sharing of warmth. It was real. Dakota stepped between them, holding his hand out. "The skybone." Calder carefully untied the thong and placed the cool, smooth amulet in Dakota's palm. Dakota held it aloft. "We make the fire pledge," he declared. He looked at Calder. "Place your hand with mine." Calder put his hand over Dakota's, covering the amulet. The bone was cold, but the chief's hand was warm. "Now you," Dakota said to his daughter. Sania placed her hand on top of Calder's. Her hand was small, but firm, and the warmth of her skin shot through his. "We swear by the skybone," Dakota intoned, his voice ringing in the clearing, "that the path we walk is for truth, that we will not shed the blood of the innocent, that the fire we light is the fire of justice, not vengeance. What is broken will be mended. What is stolen will be returned." He looked at Calder, then at Sania. "This oath binds us, until the snow melts, until the truth is known." "Until the truth is known," Sania repeated, her voice clear. Calder looked at her hand on his, then met her eyes. "Until the truth is known," he echoed. "It is done," Dakota said. He closed his fist, enclosing their hands and the amulet. "Now, we ride. The snow waits for no man." A warrior brought forward 2 ponies. One, a strong, mottled gray. was for Dakota. The other, a rangy-looking bay with a fiery eye, was for Calder. His neatly packed belongings were already tied behind the worn saddle. The party of 30 mounted, their movements efficient and silent. Calder swung his leg over the saddle, his muscles screaming in protest from the cold and the ordeal. The horse shifted under him, alive and strong. It felt good. Sania was helped onto a pony by the young warrior who had spoken out, his expression now sullen and watchful. Dakota raised his arm and pointed west, toward Pineglass Ridge. Without a word, the column of riders moved out, melting into the trees as silently as they had come. Calder Boone, the drifter, the ghost white, fell into line beside Sania. He looked one last time at the pathetic scrap of canvas that had been his home, then turned his face toward the ridge. The wind was at their backs now, and the snow was beginning to fall in earnest. Thick, heavy flakes that promised to bury the past. The journey over Pineglass Ridge was a descent into a frozen hell. The snow, which had begun as a gentle promise, turned into a furious, blinding assault. The wind didn't just howl. It screamed, a high, thin shriek that clawed at their faces and tore the breath from their lungs. It was a whiteout, a world erased, leaving only the biting cold and the terrified, plunging motion of the horses. They were no longer 30 riders. They were 30 isolated souls, each fighting a private war against the storm. Dakota led them into a deep, pine-choked draw, the trees offering a meager break from the wind. He raised his hand, his voice swallowed by the gale. But the gesture was clear. Dismount. "We do not ride through this," he roared, his voice barely carrying to Calder and Sania. "We burrow like the rabbit, like the bear we dig for your lives." There was no time for fires, no hope of pitching tents. The warriors scattered, finding drifts against the banks of the draw, attacking the snow with knives, with small hatchets, with their bare, fur-mittened hands. They worked with a frantic, desperate energy, carving shallow hollows into the packed drifts, just large enough to shield a few bodies from the killing wind. Chaos reigned. Horses whinnied, huddled together, their backs already caked in white. Men shouted, their words snatched away. Calder saw Ohan, the young warrior, helping another man whose hands were already stiff with frostbite. Dakota grabbed Calder's arm, his grip like a steel trap. "You with her in there." He shoved them toward a hollow carved beneath the roots of a massive, overturned pine. "One robe, one cave. It is the only way. Keep her warm. That is your task." It wasn't a suggestion. Calder half-dragged, half-carried Sania into the shallow hole, tumbling into the powdery darkness. It was a grave, a few feet wide, a few feet deep. The wind shrieked over the mouth of their shelter, but the direct assault was blunted. A moment later, a heavy, cured buffalo robe was thrown in after them, landing in a stiff pile. Calder pushed it toward her. "Take it." "No," Sania said, her teeth chattering so violently he could barely understand her. "We share, or we freeze. That is the mountain law." He settled beside her, their backs against the frozen dirt and tangled roots. The cold was a living thing, a presence in the cave with them. He draped the heavy robe over both of them, pulling it tight, tucking the edges under their legs. It was stiff, smelling of wood smoke and tanned hide, and offered a pathetic defense against the sub-zero chill. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm's fury, two bodies rigid with cold, but the shivering didn't stop. Calder could feel the tremors running through Sania's body, and his own were becoming uncontrollable. "It's not enough," he managed to say, his jaw aching. "The cold, it's too deep." Sania moved, her motion decisive. She turned toward him, pulling the robe tighter. "The old ones," she whispered, her voice a reedy thing. "They say you cannot fight the cold. You must share the heart. Give me your warmth." Before he could react, she shifted closer, pressing her body against his side from shoulder to hip. The contact was a jolt, but her skin, even through the layers of buckskin, was like ice. She was losing instinct, older than thought. took over. This was not man and woman. This was life and death. He turned, opening his own fur-lined coat, and pulled her into his side, wrapping the buffalo robe around them both, creating a single shared cocoon. The space was impossibly small. He could feel her shivering decrease, replaced by a finer trembling. Her head rested against his chest. He could feel the cold tip of her nose through his shirt. Her breath, which had been coming in short, panicked gasps, began to deepen, puffing in a warm, moist cloud against his neck. He was acutely aware of her, of the light weight of her in his arms, of the scent of pine smoke and winter in her hair. He rested his chin on the top of her head, his own body shaking. "Better," he whispered, his voice rough. She nodded against his chest. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice muffled. "Your heart, it is strong, like a drum." She shifted again, a small movement, and he felt her turn her head. She pressed her forehead against the side of his neck, just below his jaw, her skin still shockingly cold. "I am borrowing your heartbeat," she murmured, "to remember my own." His hand, which had been awkwardly pinned between them, found its way out. He let it rest on her shoulder, a gesture of simple comfort. The buckskin was cold, but just above the line of her dress, where the collarbone began its elegant sweep toward her neck, his fingers brushed bare skin. It was smooth and cold as marble. He gently covered the exposed skin, his thumb resting at the base of her throat, offering what little warmth his hand possessed. He felt her shudder, a long, deep sigh that was not from the cold. He felt the pulse beneath his thumb, a frantic, quick rhythm. They stayed that way, adrift in the howling dark. The wind was a solid wall of sound outside, but in their small cave, there was only the sound of their mingled breathing, a single plume of white steam rising from the huddle of robes. "In my tongue," she whispered, her voice stronger now. "We have a word, Noka. It means the courage you find in the dark, the strength that comes when you have no strength left." He thought about that. He thought about his farm, about Kincaid, about the long, hungry nights. "We have a word, too," he whispered back, his lips close to her hair. "Steadfast. It means not breaking. Holding on, no matter what." "Steadfast," she repeated, testing the shape of it. "I like this word." He felt her relax against him, a subtle softening. The shivering had almost stopped. His own body had stopped its violent shaking, replaced by a deep, radiating warmth where they touched. He shifted his head, looking down at her. In the faint, ambient light reflected from the snow outside, he could just make out the curve of her cheek, the dark sweep of her eyelashes resting against his coat. She looked up at the same moment, her eyes finding his in the gloom. They were inches apart. He could see the small beads of moisture on her lips from their shared breath. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, but not fear. It was a question, a mirroring of the same fragile, impossible feeling that was tightening his own chest. The world had shrunk to this single point, this shared darkness, this shared warmth. He didn't move. He couldn't, but he had to ask. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind and their hearts. "Sania," he breathed, his voice barely a sound. "May I?" She didn't answer with words. She just watched him, her gaze unwavering, and then, slowly, she gave a single, small nod. "Yes." He bent his head. It was not a kiss of passion, not the urgent, claiming kiss of stories. It was a kiss of discovery, as slow and hesitant as the first melt of spring. It was a mere press of lips, chapped and cold, meeting in the dark. It was a promise, a question, and an answer, all in one. It was a sharing of breath, a confirmation that they were both alive, here, together. He felt her hand, which had been resting on his chest, slide up to his shoulder, her fingers gripping his coat. He pulled the robe tighter around them, and she nestled deeper into his side, a solid living warmth against him. He drew back, his forehead resting against hers. They held each other, two souls anchored against the storm, and did not move, respecting the invisible line that lay between them, content, for now, to have simply found this shore. The dawn came not with light, but with silence. The wind had died. Calder woke stiff and sore. Sania still a warm weight against him. He eased away, his muscles protesting. Outside, the world was a blinding, pristine white. The snow drifted 4 feet deep in the draw. The tawny were already moving, digging out their horses, their movements efficient. Dakota gave Calder a single, appraising look as he crawled from the shelter, but said nothing. They rode out, the party subdued, the horses struggling through the heavy drifts. By mid-morning, they hit a ridge overlooking the flatter plains leading to Thistle Creek. "Hold!" Dakota's voice was a sharp hiss. Below them, perhaps a mile distant, a column of blue snaked through the snow. Cavalry, a patrol of at least 20 men, their breath pluming, their sabers jingling faintly on the still air. The tawny melted. They didn't retreat. They simply vanished into the folds of the land, using the snow-laden pines and rocky outcrops for cover. Calder found himself pushed into a cleft of rock, Sania's pony beside his. They watched as the patrol passed. They were not moving fast. They were scanning the hillsides, looking for something. "They found the depot," Calder whispered. "They look for us," Sania said, her hand resting on the knife at her belt, as the patrol moved on. Calder's gaze fell to the tracks they left. They were deep, cutting through the new snow to the frozen mud beneath. And then he saw it. Beside the tracks of the cavalry horses were the tracks of 2 heavy draft animals, pulling a sled. And on the sled, covered by a tarp, were crates. One of the crates had shifted, and Calder could just make out the black stencil on the raw wood. "Mallory Co." He pointed, nudging Sania. She saw it. Her eyes narrowed. When the patrol was gone, Dakota rejoined them, his face grim. Calder told him what he saw. "Mallory," Dakota said, the name tasting like poison. "Captain Horace Mallory, the commander at Fort Wallace. He and Kincaid. They are 2 hands on the same rifle?" "Kincaid." Calder felt a jolt, a sickness in his stomach. "Silas Kincaid, the man from the land office." "He is more than that," Dakota said, his gaze distant and hard. "He is the man who wants the mountains. He buys the paper. He buys the politicians. And when the paper is not enough, he buys the soldiers. They mean to cleanse this entire corridor, from here to the salt flats. They want the silver, they say, is in our hills, and they will paint us as savages to do it." The name hit Calder like a physical blow. Kincaid, the man who had destroyed his family. It wasn't just a random act of greed. It was a campaign. And now, he was right in the middle of it. They rode hard, the new information lending a grim urgency to their journey. They were pushing the animals, trying to make up for lost time. They reached Foxglove Bend, a treacherous section where the trail narrowed, with a sheer drop to the half-frozen river on one side. The attack came with no warning. A blur of gray fur exploded from the trees at the rear of the column. Wolves, a big pack, starved by the storm, made bold by the scent of the horses. One of the warriors' ponies screamed as the pack leader tore at its flank. The horse reared, throwing its rider, and the pack was on him in an instant. "Go!" Dakota roared, wheeling his horse. "Ride! Do not stop!" The column plunged forward, panic setting in. Calder looked back. Dakota and 2 other warriors were trying to fight off the animals, their rifles cracking, but the wolves were desperate. Sania's pony, already weak, stumbled, its leg buckling. Her injured leg, the one Calder had bandaged, couldn't take the jolt. She cried out, slipping from the saddle. Calder didn't think. He wheeled the bay, driving it back through the chaos. He leaned down, his arm outstretched, locking his hand in the collar of her dress. He hauled her up, his muscles screaming, lifting her clear of the snow and settling her sideways in front of him on the saddle, her arms thrown around his neck. "Hold on!" he yelled. The path ahead was blocked by the frantic, plunging horses. The only way out was across the river. "Calder, no!" Sania screamed, seeing where he was looking. "The ice, it won't hold." "It has to." He spurred the bay, away from the path, down the slick bank. The horse hit the ice sheet with a jarring crunch. It held. He urged it forward. They were halfway across when he felt the ice groan under the horse's double weight. A spiderweb of black fissures shot out from under the horse's hooves. Behind them, a wolf, bold and huge, broke from the fight and followed them, its claws scrambling on the ice. The horse panicked, slipping, its eyes rolling. "Steadfast," Calder roared, as much to himself as to the animal. A massive fissure shot out ahead of them, a 3-foot gap of black. Rushing water. The horse bunched its muscles. A desperate gamble. It leaped, a convulsive, flying surge of power. They landed on the far side with a crash that sent chips of ice flying. The horse scrambled up the snowy bank, not stopping, plunging into the trees. They rode for another 5 minutes before Calder finally pulled the heaving, trembling animal to a stop. They were safe. He was shaking, his arms locked around Sania, her face buried in his chest. He could feel her whole body trembling. "It's all right," he panted, his own heart hammering. "We're safe." She pulled back, her eyes wide, her knuckles white where she gripped his coat. She looked at him, then at his wrist, where the skybone amulet had come loose from his sleeve. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold bone. "The winter promise," she said, her voice a near whisper. "It is not just for the tawny. It is the law of the high country. It promises safe passage for all tribes, all traders, anyone who honors the mountain. To break it to burn the depot, to kill the traitors. They have made themselves an enemy of every living thing in these hills." She refastened the thong, her fingers working deftly at his wrist. Her hands were warm now. When she was finished, her hand lingered, covering his, her fingers laced with his over the amulet. He looked at her, his hand covering hers. It was a promise, silent and absolute. He would protect her, and she, him. When they rejoined the main group, Dakota nodded grimly. They had lost 1 man and 2 horses. The mood was dark. From the back of the line, Ohan watched them. He had fought bravely, his arm slick with a shallow cut from a wolf's claw. He saw the white man, the outsider, riding with the chief's daughter held tight in his arms. He saw the way she looked at him, the way her hand rested on his, and his eyes, dark and watchful, narrowed with a suspicion that was its own kind of winter. Thistle Creek was not a town, it was a scar. It squatted in a narrow, dirty valley, a cluster of raw lumber buildings and muddy, frozen streets huddled against the encroaching snows. It smelled of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and desperation. The only sign of life, the only spark of warmth in the deepening twilight, was Marla Voss's saloon. Its windows glowed a greasy, welcoming yellow, spilling light onto the churned snow of the main street. The sign above the door, the railhead, was a lie. The tracks were still 30 miles east, but the saloon served as the town's beating heart. It was the post office, the land office, and the unofficial railroad terminus, where mailbags were dropped by express riders and information was traded like currency. Dakota dismounted, his movement stiff. He, Calder, and Sania approached the door, leaving the other warriors hidden in the rocky bluffs that ringed the town like a crown of thorns. Ohan, his arm bandaged and his face a mask of mistrust, lingered in the alley across the street, a rifle cradled in his arms. Calder pushed open the bat-wing doors. The noise hit him first, a wave of laughter, shouting, and the tinny, frantic pounding of an out-of-tune piano. The air was thick with blue smoke, so dense it blurred the men at the far end of the bar. Maybe 15 or 20 patrons, trappers, miners. A few rough-looking men in worn army coats looked up. The saloon went dead silent. The piano player's hands froze above the keys. Every eye swiveled to the door. Not to Calder, the anonymous, ragged white man, but to Dakota, a tawny chief standing tall in their midst, and to Sania, his daughter, her face proud, her limp obvious. It was an invasion. A woman's voice cut through the tension, sharp and practical. "Well, don't just stand there letting the cold in. You're buying or you're leaving, and you're leaving the hardware by the door." She stood behind the bar, wiping a glass, Marla Voss. She was perhaps 40. A widow who had inherited the saloon and ran it with an iron will. Her black hair was pinned up, and her eyes, quick and intelligent, missed nothing. She didn't look afraid. She looked annoyed. Dakota unbelted his knife and laid it on the bar. Calder did the same. "We're looking for supplies," Dakota said, his voice even. Marla's eyes flicked to Sania's leg, then back to Dakota. She knew him. There was a flicker of old understanding there. "Supplies are at the mercantile. This here is for whiskey and bad decisions." She jerked her head toward a back room. "My office. We can talk supplies in there." The office was a cramped, cold closet smelling of stale beer and ink. Marla lit a small oil lamp, casting huge, flickering shadows. She didn't sit. "You're a fool for coming here." "Dakota," she whispered, her voice losing its barroom edge, becoming urgent. "The whole town's a hornet's nest. Kincaid's men are everywhere." "We know," Dakota said. "We're not here for Kincaid. We're here for the truth. The salt depot." Marla let out a short, bitter laugh. "The truth in Thistle Creek, that'll cost you." She leaned closer, the lamplight carving hollows in her face. "You're too late. Silas Kincaid doesn't just want this town anymore. He bought it. He bought the mayor. He bought the sheriff. And he's got Horace Mallory eating out of his hand. The truth, as you call it, is whatever Kincaid says it is." "What do you know?" Calder interrupted, his voice rough. He didn't have patience for this. Marla's sharp eyes turned to him, sizing him up. "I know that Kincaid is moving his paperwork tonight. He's been buying up all the foreclosures and mining claims, using dummy companies. But the Army's sending an inspector tomorrow, sniffing around about Mallory's Indian problem. Kincaid's cleaning house. He's moving his real ledgers, the ones that prove the payments." "Where?" Dakota asked. "The old freight warehouse, by the Lantern Bridge," she said. "A wagon's due to pick him up before midnight. He's shipping them east, where no one can touch them." The air in the tiny room felt thin. This was it. The link. "We need those ledgers." Dakota said, "You're not we." Marla shot back. "You ride in there, and you'll have the whole town shooting at you. They're jumpy. They're expecting a tawny raid." Her eyes widened as she realized. That's his plan, the depot fire. It wasn't just to get the Army here. It was to give him an excuse to move his operation, and have the whole town bless him for it. "He needs to get in," Dakota said, nodding at Calder. "The Ghost White." Calder's stomach clenched, but he knew the man was right. "I'll go. I can slip in. Find the ledger." "I am going," Sania said, her voice quiet but unbending. "My leg is strong enough. I am quieter than he is." "No," Dakota started. "He does not know what a land ledger looks like," Sania insisted, looking at her father. "I do. I have seen the white man's paper thievery. I know the name Kincaid." Before Dakota could argue, Marla spoke. "She's right. He's just muscle. She's got the eyes. But you'll need a third, to watch the bridge, to warn you. They'll have guards." From the doorway, Ohan spoke, startling them all. "I will go." He had left his post, his face set in a stubborn, jealous mask. "I will not let her go alone with him." Dakota looked at the three of them, a broken, mismatched team of suspicion and desperation. He nodded. "Once. Get the book. Do not be seen. Do not fight. Get the book and get out. The rest of us will be on the cliffs, watching. If we hear one shot." He left the threat hanging in the air. The warehouse was a black, hulking shape against the snow-covered riverbank. The Lantern Bridge, a long, rickety wooden structure, was the only way across the fast-moving water. Its namesake lanterns unlit tonight. Calder moved first, a shadow against shadows. He found a loose board on a side window and worked it free with his knife. He slipped inside, into the pitch black. The air was cold, smelling of salt, canvas, and old iron. Sania followed, landing as lightly as a cat, her limp barely making a sound. Ohan, grunting, took up a position outside, hiding in a deep drift that gave him a view of the bridge. Calder pulled Sania into the deepest shadow. "Where?" he whispered. "An office," she breathed back, her hand brushing his. "There is always an office, where the boss sits." They found it at the back, a small, raised platform with a single door, locked. Calder put his shoulder to it, but it was solid. Sania pushed him aside. She took a thin piece of metal from her boot, a stay from a corset, filed to a point and knelt by the lock. She worked it for a full minute, her breath held, then click. The door swung open on a creak. The office was small, holding a pot-bellied stove, a desk, and a large, heavy safe. But on the desk, left out in haste, was a thick, leather-bound book, a ledger. Calder struck one of his precious matches. In the brief, flaring light, Sania's finger flew down the page. Dates, names, figures. Foreclosure Boone, foreclosure Hemlock. Then she stopped. Her finger rested on an entry at the bottom of the page. Dated 3 days ago. Disbursement, she read, her voice trembling. To Anonymous Security Unit for $500. That's it. Calder breathed. That's the payment. For the depot. Find what you're looking for. Trapper? The voice was rough, amused. A lantern flared to life in the main warehouse, blinding them. Calder shoved Sania behind him, the match burning his fingers as he dropped it. 3 men, no, 4. They were standing where there had been only crates. They wore heavy buffalo coats, but beneath them, Calder saw the dark blue of Army-issue trousers. They weren't soldiers, but they were supplied by them. "Kincaid doesn't like rats in his pantry," the leader said, leveling a revolving rifle. A shot exploded from outside. Oh, Han, he had seen the trap. He fired at the lantern, trying to plunge them back into darkness. The glass shattered, but the wick still burned. And the leader turned, firing his rifle twice, blindly, into the dark where Ohan's flash had been. A strangled cry. "Sania." Sania didn't hesitate. She bolted from the office, running toward the danger, back toward the loading bay. "Ohan, damn it!" Calder roared. He grabbed the only thing he could, a heavy crate hook, and threw it. It spun end over end, clattering uselessly against the wall. But it bought him a second. The gunman fired. The sound in the enclosed space was deafening. Splinters exploded from the door frame where Calder's head had been. He lunged, following Sania, grabbing the heavy ledger as he went. He saw one of the gunmen raise his rifle, the light from the dying lantern glinting on the polished wooden stock, carved into the wood. Clear as day were the initials H.M., Horace Mallory. Calder burst through the loading door. Sania was 10 yards ahead, kneeling in the snow beside Ohan, who was clutching his shoulder. Blood, a black stain on his coat. She was trying to pull him into the shadow of the alley. The gunmen burst out after them. Get him! Get him!" Calder yelled, running low. He was trapped. The alley was a dead end, a sheer wall of snow and rock at the far side. He was pinned behind a miserable stack of rain barrels. The gunmen advanced, taking their time. Sania was trying to stop Ohan's bleeding, her hands covered in it. Then Calder saw it. Next to him, not barrels, sacks, dozens of them, stacked 10 feet high, stamped on the side. Thistle Creek Milling, fine flour. He shoved. The stack was impossibly heavy. He roared, putting his back into it, feeling his muscles tear. The top of the stack teetered, leaned, and then went. A bullet tore through the top sack as it fell. The world vanished in a choking, blinding cloud of white. The flour exploded, a ghostly fog that instantly filled the alley. The gunman cursed, coughing. "Now!" Calder screamed. He grabbed Sania, pulling her up. "Grab his legs!" He slung the ledger over his shoulder by its leather strap, then hooked his arms under Ohan's. Together, they hauled the groaning warrior, dragging him through the cloud of flour, back toward the main street. They were all ghosts, covered head to toe in white. They half ran, half fell through the alley, emerging onto the street. The town was waking up. Shouts echoed. Lights were coming on. Calder skidded to a halt, his heart stopping. There, nailed to the wall of the post office, directly under the light of Marla's saloon, was a piece of paper. It was new, the ink still black against the white. Wanted reward. It didn't have his name. It didn't need to. For questioning vagrant, drifter brown hair, canvas coat last seen Ashwind Range. It was him. It was a perfect description. Marla, he breathed. But how she had helped them. Move, Senia hissed, pulling him. They knew you were here. They ran, plunging into the darkness at the edge of town, scrambling up the slick rocks to the rendezvous point. Dakota was there, his face a mask of stone. They were waiting. Calder panted, dumping the ledger at Dakota's feet. And someone in that town described me. Someone knew I was coming. Marla Voss was there, breathless, her shawl clutched around her. I don't know how. I swear it. Dakota, I told no one. Her eyes were wide with fear. They were waiting for you at the bridge, too. Dakota's gaze was hard, searching her face. He seemed to believe her. Then the informant is not you, but he is in that town. He is in your saloon. Marla looked at Calder, at the flower covering him, at the blood on Sania. Her face hardened with decision. She fumbled in her pocket and pressed a small, cold, intricate brass key into Calder's hand. The post office, she whispered. Fast. It's the key to Kincaid's private safe, behind the mail slots. If you get this ledger to the inspector, this key will open the rest. It's my insurance. Go, get out of here. A sharp whistle cut through the night. A warrior, perched high on the cliff, was pointing. They all turned. Far below, the lantern bridge was no longer a dark shape. It was a skeleton of brilliant, roaring orange. Flames licked up into the night sky, consuming the dry wood. As they watched, the center span groaned and collapsed into the icy river, sending a shower of sparks hissing into the black water. Their way back was gone. He cut us off, Sania whispered, her voice full of horror. He's trapped us on this side of the river. This is not a trap, Dakota said, his voice a low growl. This is a hunt. He means to finish this here. He turned to Ohan, who was fading fast. We cross here, the river. Calder stared at the black, rushing water, choked with ice flows. It'll kill us. Staying here will kill us faster, Dakota said. He hefted Ohan's other side. We go. Calder nodded. He took Ohan's full weight, slinging the young warrior onto his back. Ohan was a dead weight, his head lolling. Calder stepped into the water. The cold was a physical blow, a pain so sharp it drove the air from his lungs. It was liquid ice, clutching, pulling. He stumbled, a rock shifting under his boot. The current, fast and deadly, tried to sweep his legs out from under him. Sania was right beside him, the ledger now strapped to her own back. She held onto Calder's belt with one hand, and with the other, she pressed a wad of cloth against Ohan's bleeding shoulder, trying to staunch the flow. He could hear her voice a low, desperate chant, praying to the mountain, to the river spirits, in her own tongue. Ohan, his body rigid with cold and pain, began to shiver. He was delirious. He groaned, his head rolling against Calder's neck. Wrath, he mumbled, his voice a wet, broken sound. Must tell Wrath, the packet. It's compromised. Tell Mallory. His voice died in a gurgle as an ice floe struck Calder in the chest, nearly knocking them all down. Dakota, just behind, heard it. His hand shot out, grabbing Calder's shoulder, steadying him. In the roaring darkness of the river, their eyes met. Wrath, Dakota said, the name a snake's hiss. Corporal Wrath, Mallory's dog, his personal liaison, the man who carries the messages between the fort and Kincaid. Calder nodded, grit his teeth against the cold, and took another step. They had the book, and now they had the messenger. The place was called Falling Snow Camp. It was not a camp, but a village, hidden in a deep, sheltered box canyon that was invisible from any trail. The entrance was a narrow cleft in the rock, barely wide enough for 2 horses, disguised by a thick fall of ancient pines. Calder, half dead from the river crossing, his clothes frozen solid, stumbled into a world of warmth and life. Dozens of lodges, reinforced with sod and hide against the deep snow, were nestled in the canyon floor. A spring, steaming in the cold, ran through the center. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat and pine. Women and children, faces appearing in the flaps of lodges, watched him, their eyes wide and silent. He was the first white man many had ever seen this close. Ohan was rushed to a large lodge at the center, the Healer's Lodge. Calder and Sania were taken to another, Takota's own, where a fire roared. Takota's wife, a quiet, strong woman named Ihawi, brought them hot broth and dry skins, her face betraying no emotion as she tended to the strange, half-frozen man her husband had brought home. Hours later, dry and warm, Calder was summoned. He walked out into the falling snow. Ohan was alive, the bullet having passed clean through the flesh of his shoulder. The mood of the camp, however, was not relief. It was a low, simmering fear. He was led to the council lodge. It was the largest structure, its roof held up by 4 massive pine trunks. A great circular fire pit dominated the center. In the flickering, smoky light, he saw the faces of the elders, a dozen men and 4 old women, their faces maps of deep-running wisdom and worry. They sat on thick furs. Takota stood at the head. Calder was left standing alone in the center, a conspicuous, pale ghost in this private world. The ledger he had carried was at his feet. Takota spoke in his own tongue, his voice rising and falling in a powerful cadence. He recounted the burning of the depot, the lies, the ambush, and the escape. He told of Sania's rescue. When he finished, he walked to Calder. He held a thin, braided cord of red sinew. "You are Calder Boone," he said, his voice loud for all to hear. "You saved my daughter. You bled for my people. You are a stranger, but you are not an enemy." He took Calder's left wrist. "By the law of our fathers, we give you the welcome of the footstep." He tied the red cord around Calder's wrist, next to the skybone amulet Sania had given him. "This thread says you have walked our path. It says you are Talahoni, a long journey brother. You may eat at our fires. You may sleep in our lodges. You are protected. Our blood is your blood." Calder felt the weight of it. This was not a gift. It was a binding. A harsh voice cut through the lodge. "He is Vasichu, a white man. He brings only the army. The long journey brother has brought Mallory's riders to our door. A tall, gaunt elder, his face scarred, rose to his feet. His name was Hakan. My nephew lies bleeding. This stranger was seen by the men who shot him. They were not waiting for Ohan. They were waiting for him. He is bait. He is our guest. Hakan," Takota said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He is a curse," Hakan spat. "We have been hiding, running, for 10 winters. Now we are found. We must fight. We must ride on the fort. We must answer their bullet with our arrow. We must have vengeance." A roar of approval went up from some of the younger men in the lodge. The air grew thick and violent. "You would fight a blizzard with a stone," a new voice said. It was thin as dry leaves, but it cut through the anger like a knife. A woman, so old her skin seemed like parchment, was helped to her feet. This was Ayana Snowthistle, Takota's grandmother, the oldest of the tribe. She walked slowly to the fire, leaning on a stick. "You are a fool, Hakan. You have the hot blood, but the cold mind. You want vengeance." She pointed a long, bony finger at the leather ledger. "But Kincaid's crime is not blood. It is paper. His weapon is ink. You cannot fight a contract with a lance. You cannot scalp a lie." She turned her ancient, clouded eyes on the council. We wait for the proof. This book is the smoke. We must find the fire." Hakan looked ready to argue, but he would not defy her. He sat, his face a mask of fury. Then Sania stood. Her voice, clear and strong, filled the lodge. "Grandmother speaks truth," she said, "but we are out of time. Mallory comes. And this man." She laid her hand on Calder's arm. A public, defiant gesture. "Is the one who must help us. He is the one who found me. He is the one who carried me. When I was lost, he was my path." She looked at Calder, her eyes shining in the firelight, and used the words she had taught him. He is Noka. He has the courage of the dark. He is the keeper of the path. I will stand with him. A murmur went through the lodge. It was one thing to honor a rescuer. It was another for the chief's daughter to publicly claim him, to give him a title of honor. The rumors that had begun when they rode in, sharing a horse, were now confirmed in the eyes of the tribe. Calder felt the weight of 100 gazes, speculative and knowing. Later that night, the tribe gathered around a great central bonfire. It was not a celebration, but a healing. A single, heavy drum beat a rhythm slow as a heart, for Ohan, for the warrior they had lost to the wolves. Calder stood in the shadows, outside the circle, feeling every inch the outsider. The red thread on his wrist felt like it was burning. Sania emerged from the lodge, her duty to her family done. She walked directly to him. The snow fell softly, melting in her dark hair. "You are not a ghost here. Calder Boone," she said softly. "You are Talahoni. Your place is by the fire." She took his hand. It was not a request. He let her lead him into the moving circle of people. The dance was simple, a rhythmic, side-to-side step, the entire tribe moving as one body around the flames. He was clumsy, awkward. She smiled, a small, private smile. "Feel the drum, not the feet." She guided him, her hand in his. As they moved, their bodies brushed. He was overwhelmingly aware of her. He put his other hand on her waist, resting lightly on the buckskin. She put her hand on his shoulder. It was a formal, proper hold. Yet, in that moment, it was the most intimate thing he had ever known. They moved together, finding the rhythm, their eyes locked. The world of snow and fear and angry counsels melted away, leaving only the heat of the fire, the beat of the drum, and the absolute trust in her gaze. After a time, the drum slowed. The dance broke. People began to drift back to their lodges. Sania led him away from the dying fire, to the edge of the camp, where the black pines stood sentinel, their branches heavy with snow. It was quiet here, only the soft sound of the flakes touching the ground. "You spoke for me," he said, his voice rough. "In the council, you shouldn't have. It puts you in danger." "The truth is never a danger," she replied. Turning to face him, she stood very close. "It is a shield." He reached up, his hand hesitant, and brushed a snowflake from her cheek. His fingers were rough against her skin. "Sania," he breathed. The kiss, this time, was not the hesitant, cold discovery in the snow cave. It was a choice. He leaned in, and she met him. It was a deep, slow kiss that spoke of trust, of shared peril, of a profound, aching relief. It was a feeling of safety, a feeling of being seen for the first time in his life. He tasted the wood smoke on her lips, and the cold, clean air of the mountain. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, her fingers gripping his coat. His own hands moved to cup her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. The kiss deepened, a silent, desperate communication. He pulled her closer, his arms sliding around her waist, and she pressed herself against him, a solid, living warmth in the cold. It was a surge of feeling, a powerful, clean wave of it that made his knees weak. He was the one who pulled back. He rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in a single white cloud. He was trembling. "When this is over," he whispered, his voice thick. "When Kincaid is done. When there is peace." She closed her eyes, her own breath unsteady. She nodded against him. "When there is peace." It was a promise of a future, a line drawn in the snow. They simply held each other, two souls anchored in the storm. Later, Calder did his duty as Talahoni. He brought a bowl of hot, thin broth to the healer's lodge. Ohan was awake, propped up against a pile of furs, his face pale and tight with pain. He saw Calder and his eyes tightened. Calder held out the bowl. "For your strength." Ohan looked at the bowl, then at Calder's face. He took it with his good hand. "I spoke against you," Ohan said, his voice a low rasp. "In my heart, I thought you were a bad omen. The omen was Kincaid, Calder said, sitting on a stool. You pulled me from the alley. You carried me across the river. The gratitude in his voice was real, and heavy with shame. I owe you my life. We're even, Calder said. You took a bullet meant for us. Just then, Sania's shadow fell across the doorway. Calder, my father, he needs you. She was looking only at Calder. She had not even seen Ohan. Ohan watched her, saw the unconscious intimacy in her voice, the way her eyes softened when she said Calder's name. A complex, dark emotion moved across his face. He was grateful. Yes, but he was also a young warrior who had watched this girl all his life. And this outsider, this ghost white, had stolen her in 3 days. The gratitude remained, but it now had a bitter, jealous root. The council lodge was in turmoil. A scout, his face rimed with ice, was speaking in low, urgent tones to Dakota. Dakota turned as Calder entered. His face was granite. Mallory, he's not waiting for an inspector. He has gathered 25 cavalry and a dozen volunteers from Thistle Creek. He is riding. He says he is coming to inspect this camp for goods stolen from the depot. He's coming to finish the job, Calder said. He will be here by tomorrow night. Dakota said. He looked at Calder, his gaze heavy. The council is clear. You are Talahoni. Your debt is paid. We promised you a horse and shelter. The shelter is gone, but the horse is yours. Ride south. Ride fast. This is not your fight. Calder Boone. No one will blame you. Go. Save your own skin. The entire lodge was silent, watching him. This was his one honorable way out. He could be free. He could be the drifter again. Invisible. Calder looked at the fire. He looked at Sania, who stood by her father, her face pale but resolute. He thought of Kincaid's smug, satisfied face. He thought of the words Sania had taught him. Noka. He thought of his own. Steadfast. I'm not running from him again, Calder said, his voice quiet, but it carried to every corner of the lodge. I'm not a ghost. I'm not a victim. He burned my family. He's trying to burn yours. I stay. A single sharp cry of approval came from one of the younger warriors. Dakota stared at him, and a slow, deep respect dawned in his eyes. He nodded. Once. Then we fight, Dakota said. He walked to the fire and placed the skybone amulet on the hearthstone. But we fight his way. Ayana is right. We fight paper with paper. We cannot stop Mallory's soldiers. Not here. Not in the open. Calder stepped forward. He held up the small, intricate brass key that Marla had given him. This is the fire, he said. The ledger is the accusation. The proof, the letters. The real payments is in Kincaid's safe. In the post office. Dakota understood instantly. We split our forces. Ehawi Ayana, you will lead the evacuation. The women, the children, the old ones to the high caves. Hawken, you will take the war party. You will lead Mallory on a false chase into the deep drifts of Stonevale Valley. Make him think he is chasing us all. He turned, his eyes finding Calder and Sania, and, in the doorway of the lodge, Ohan, who had pulled himself up, his arm in a sling. And a small group, Dakota said, his voice a blade, a shadow. They will go back to Thistle Creek. They will use this key, and they will cut the head from the snake. They will steal the poison papers of Silas Kincaid. The Railhead Saloon was a fortress of light and noise in the otherwise dead silent town. Marla Voss met them not at the front, but in the icy alley behind the saloon, where the air reeked of frozen garbage and stale beer. She was bundled in a man's heavy wool coat. Ohan, his arm in a sling and his face pale but rigid, stood watch with Sania, both hidden in the absolute blackness of a wagon shed. You're late, Marla whispered, her voice a sharp plume of white. I've been hearing patrols. Kincaid's hired guns, not soldiers. They're jumpy. We were delayed, Calder said, his eyes scanning the rooftops. The town felt wrong. A trap waiting to be sprung. The post office is connected, Marla said, pointing to a low, solid-looking structure attached to the rear of her saloon. Kincaid likes his business close. He owns the building. The mail is just a convenience. She led him to a thick, iron-reinforced door. The brass key she had given Calder slid into the lock with a well-oiled, terrifyingly quiet snick. She pushed the door open into a darkness that smelled of canvas mailbags, acidic ink, and the faint, dry scent of mice. Marla lit a small, shielded lantern, turning the wick so low it barely cast a circle of light. The room was lined with sorting slots, a long counter, and in the back, a heavy, black iron safe, squat and imposing. "This is it," she breathed, kneeling. "Kinkin's bank, his real office." She didn't use the key. She used her fingers, spinning the dial. Click, whir, thud. Her hands moved with a practiced confidence that told Calder this wasn't the first time she'd been in here. The heavy door swung open. It was full. Stacks of paper, canvas bags heavy with coin, and several thick ledgers. But Sania, who had slipped in behind them, pointed to a small, wooden box. Calder pulled it out. It wasn't locked. Inside were three things. The first was a heavy brass seal, its handle worn, bearing the insignia of the Kincaid Railland Company. The second was a rolled map, drawn with professional care. Sania unrolled it on the counter. In the dim light, they saw the black ink lines. It was a survey of the misty stone corridor. It cut directly, arrogantly, through the heart of the Tawny's protected wintering grounds. The third was a thin sheaf of letters, bound with a simple leather thong. Calder untied it. He recognized the crisp, authoritative handwriting from the ledger. Captain H. Mallory. He read the first few lines, his lips moving silently. It was damning. Mallory was confirming the successful dispersal of the salt depot and requesting payment for the anonymous security unit, the exact phrase from the warehouse ledger. He was handing the letter to Sania when his eyes caught the page beneath it. It wasn't a letter. It was a list, a separate accounting sheet, titled Regional Liabilities, Finalized. His breath stopped. The list had maybe 20 names, each followed by a sum of money and a single, stamped word. He scanned them. Elias, Finch, McGregor, and then, fourth from the bottom, his own, Boone, Ezekiel, his father's name. He saw the original loan, $500. He saw the column for interest, a figure so wildly inflated it was pure fantasy. And then he saw the final sum. The one Kincaid had demanded $2,250, an impossible sum, designed to be impossible. And next to it, the final, brutal stamp, pressed in blood-red ink, foreclosed, S.K. The room vanished. The cold in his hands was gone, replaced by a white-hot, blinding fire. He wasn't in the post office. He was 16 again, standing in the cold mud, smelling the damp wool of Kincaid's suit. He heard his father's broken, pleading voice. He saw his mother's face, pale and thin, watching her life being carried out into the yard. It wasn't a bad loan. It wasn't bad luck. It was this piece of paper, this lie, crafted in ink, that had murdered his family as surely as a bullet. His hand, of its own volition, went to the knife at his belt. The papers in his other hand crumpled as his fist clenched. He was going to burn this building. He was going to burn this whole rotten town to the ground. He was going to find Kincaid and Calder. Sania's voice, quiet, small. He didn't hear it. Calder. A hand, warm and firm, covered his, the one that was crushing the paper. He flinched, his head snapping toward her. Her face, illuminated in the faint lantern light, and was not afraid. It was steady. Her eyes were fixed on his, holding him, anchoring him. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice a low whisper, but it cut through the roaring in his head. "This," she touched the crumpled paper, "is his way, the lie, the paper." Then her gaze flickered to the hand he had on his knife. "If you use that, in this rage you become him. You become the fire that burns everything. The Tawny do not seek this kind of vengeance." He was shaking, a deep, violent tremor that started in his gut. His breath was coming in ragged gasps. She leaned in, her forehead almost touching his. "We are here for justice, for rightful revenge, not for ashes. Be steadfast. Calder, stay with me." The word, his word to her, hit him like a splash of icy water. The red haze in his vision receded, the roaring faded, replaced by the pounding of his own heart. He looked down at his hand, white-knuckled on the hilt of his knife. He let go. He shuddered, a long, ragged breath tearing out of him. He looked at her, his eyes still wild, but he was there. He was back. He carefully, slowly, uncrumpled the page. His father's name was still there, but now it was not just a brand of rage, it was a piece of evidence. "Rightful revenge," he repeated, his voice a rasp. A boot crunched on the packed snow outside the alley door. "He's in there," a voice yelled. "I saw the lights around the back." Marla didn't hesitate. She blew out the lantern, plunging them into absolute darkness. "The bell," she hissed. "They're going to raise the town go roof." She shoved Calder toward a stack of mailbags under a high, square window. Calder threw the papers into his coat, shoved Sania up, and scrambled after her. They tumbled out onto a low, sloping roof, slick with fresh snow. The night exploded. A bell, high and frantic, began to clang from the center of town. Shouts erupted. Doors slammed. "This way across the gap," Marla yelled. Running low, her skirts hitched up. A shot cracked, the muzzle flash a brilliant, blinding orange from the alley below. The bullet whined past Calder's ear. Ohan, who had been watching from the wagon shed, burst out, firing his pistol at the man in the alley. "Run! I will hold them." "Ohan, no!" Sania screamed. "Go, it is my honor." He fired again, forcing the gunman back into cover. Calder, Sania, and Marla reached the edge of the roof. A 6-foot gap of blackness separated them from the next building, the Mercantile. "I can't," Marla panted, looking at the jump. Calder didn't waste time. He grabbed her, swung her across the gap like a sack of grain, and shoved her onto the opposite roof. He turned for Sania. She was already moving, launching herself across. He caught her, her momentum carrying them both skidding onto the icy shingles. "Behind you." 3 men were climbing onto the post office roof where they had just been. Ohan was trapped, stuck between them and the gunman in the alley. He made his choice. He turned to face the 3 men, his knife in his good hand, blocking the narrow roof line. "This far," he roared. "For the Tawny!" The men didn't stop. They raised their rifles. "No!" Calder yelled. He lunged back toward the gap. But the roof Ohan stood on was old, part of the original saloon structure. It had not been maintained. The gunman fired. Ohan grunted, hit in his good shoulder, staggering back. His weight, combined with the sudden impact, was too much. With a groan of rotten wood and tearing nails, the entire section of roof under Ohan's feet gave way. Sania screamed. Ohan's hand, the one holding the knife, shot out, grabbing the edge of the stable roof as he fell. He dangled, his boots kicking in the empty air, held only by the grip of his wounded arm. The 3 gunmen had vanished into the collapsing hole. Calder was already there, flat on his stomach. His arm plunged into the darkness. He grabbed Ohan's wrist. "I have you, don't move!" Ohan's face was a pale mask of agony. His grip was failing. "Let me go, I am finished!" "Shut up and climb!" Calder roared, pulling with every fiber of his being. He felt his shoulders screaming. He couldn't get the leverage. Sania was beside him, grabbing Ohan's coat, adding her strength to his. Together, they hauled the young warrior, inch by agonizing inch, up from the darkness. They dragged him over the lip of the roof, collapsing in a heap, panting, just as the last of the rotten timbers crashed into the alley below, sealing the passage. "Down now!" Marla's voice was a sharp command. She was at the far end of the Mercantile roof, prying at a dark square opening. "The old drainage. It goes to the river." They didn't hesitate. They slid down the steep pitch of the roof and dropped one by one into the opening, into a black, frozen pipe. Calder went last, pulling Ohan in with him. The change was instantaneous. The frantic ringing of the bell and the shouts of the town were snuffed out, replaced by a profound, hollow silence. The only sound was the drip of melting ice and their own desperate, ragged breathing. It was a square-cut culvert, maybe 4 feet high, built of stone. It was slick with ice, the air so cold their breath hung in the darkness as a solid, unmoving cloud. They were soaked from the snow, bleeding, and trapped. Cauldron slumped against the icy stone wall, his body finally acknowledging the adrenaline, the rage, the terror. He began to shake. It was the deep, uncontrollable shiver of shock, a cold that started in his bones. Sania, huddled in the darkness, heard it, the rasp of his coat against the stone. She crawled the 2 feet that separated them. Calder. He didn't respond. He was staring into a darkness only he could see, his father's name branded on his thoughts. She reached out, her hands freezing, and placed them on his cheeks. His skin was like ice. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. "Calder," she whispered, her voice full of a desperate tenderness. She rubbed his face, trying to force warmth, life, back into him. "You are frozen," she murmured. "You are shaking." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. It was the only warmth in the world. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I saw where you went, in the office. Don't go there. Stay here with me." He opened his eyes, in the absolute black. He could only feel her small, cold hands on his face, her breath on his lips. He covered her hands with his own, pressing her palms tight against his skin. He leaned his forehead against hers, a desperate, anchoring gesture. "I'm here," he breathed. He found her lips in the dark, a brief, cold, desperate kiss that was not about passion, but about survival. It was a promise. "I'm still here." She clung to him, a quick, tight embrace in the impossible. Freezing confines of the pipe, it was a shared moment of life, snatched from the jaws of the grave. "We have to move." Marla's voice, strained and shaky, came from the darkness up ahead. "This pipe will fill when the melt comes, and I don't want to be here when they find it." They crawled for what felt like miles, dragging Ohan between them. Finally, they saw it, a round, gray circle of moonlight. They spilled out of the pipe, one after another, onto the frozen riverbank. Collapsing into the deep snow, drifts under a stand of black pines. Dakota was there, his face carved from stone. 2 warriors and 4 horses, hidden, waiting. "The town is awake," Dakota stated. "We have them," Calder said, his voice raw. He pulled the sheaf of wet papers from his coat. "They're soaked, but they're readable." He handed the map, Mallory's letters, and the single, crumpled page with his father's name to the chief. Dakota looked at the debt list. He saw the name Boone. His eyes lifted, meeting Calder's. He said nothing, but the understanding was total. This was no longer a favor. This was a shared war. "My scout reports," Dakota said, his voice low. "Hawkins' party has been seen. Mallory is taking the bait, leading his full command toward Stonevale Valley. He thinks he has us trapped. The women, the children, they are safe in the high caves. Ahawi and Ayana are with them." Marla Voss, her hair down, her face smudged with soot, leaned against a tree, breathing hard. "Good. Then it's my turn. Dry Lantern Post is 30 miles south, but they have a telegraph. I know a man at the Denver Tribune who would sell his soul to get Silas Kincaid. I can get the word out. Give me 2 days. The U.S. Marshals, maybe even an inspector from Washington. I can bring the law." "Good," Dakota said. "You bring the law. We will provide the proof." He held up Mallory's wet letter. "But this is not enough. This is an order to a hireling. The real proof. The private letters between Kincaid and Mallory. The orders from Kincaid himself. He would never keep those in a town safe." Calder looked up, the pieces clicking into place. Ohan's words in the river. Wrath, the packet, a soldier's dog. Dakota spat. Wrath would only carry a packet that important to one place. The one place Mallory trusts. Calder finished the thought, the name tasting like ash. Fort Pineglass. His own command. Dakota nodded. A grim, final decision. Håkon draws the army east. Marla brings the reporters. And we. He looked at Calder, at Sania, and at the wounded. Grim-faced Ohan. We will use the distraction. We will ride to the fort itself, and we will take the poison papers from the Serpent's Den. The world had shrunk to the confines of Stonevale Valley. Captain Horace Mallory, having taken Hawkins' bait, had sealed the box canyon with a methodical, cruel patience. His 25 cavalry, bolstered by a dozen of Kincaid's hired guns, controlled the only entrance. They were a line of blue and black against the white snow, a noose tightening. From a high, wind-swept ridge a mile to the west, Dakota's small party watched. Calder, Dakota, Sania, Ohan, and 2 of the tribe's best scouts, Asa and Eli, lay flat, the wind tearing at their fur wraps. They were the hunters, now watching the trappers. A rider emerged from Mallory's line, carrying a white flag of truce that seemed a mockery. He rode to the center of the valley, just out of arrow shot from Hawkins' hidden positions. He unrolled a parchment. His voice, thin and reedy, was carried up to them on the wind. By order of the United States Army, in accordance with the Territorial Preservation Act, a bounty is placed, $100 in gold, for the capture of the native, or natives, bearing the sacred amulet known as the Winter Promise. This item, having been used to declare a false war, is forfeit. Sania gasped, her hand flying to her father's neck, where the skybone amulet was hidden beneath his leathers. He is breaking the faith, Dakota whispered, his voice a low growl. He is turning our own symbol against us. He wants the settlers, the other tribes, to see us as the oath breakers. He's giving them an excuse to hunt you, Calder said, his stomach cold. The tension in the valley was a tangible thing. Hawkins' warriors, trapped below, were masters of patience. But Mallory's men were getting restless. The stalemate was broken by a sudden, frantic shout. A supply sled, trying to cross a wide, frozen stretch of the river that snaked through the valley, had hit a patch of thin ice. The ice gave way with a groan, and one of the younger soldiers, a boy of maybe 17 with a face pale with peach fuzz, plunged into the black, rushing water. His comrades shouted, backing away from the fractured ice, throwing ropes that fell short. The boy's wool coat was dragging him down. He surfaced once, his mouth a perfect O of terror, before the current pulled him under. "Do nothing," Dakota commanded, his hand on Calder's arm. "This is not our fight." Calder watched, his muscles locked. He saw the boy's blue-mittened hand break the surface, clawing at the ice, then slip back under. He remembered Silas Kincaid's voice. "It's just business, son." "The hell it's not," Calder said. Before Dakota could stop him, he was moving. He slid, half ran, down the rocky incline, using the cover of the boulders, his movements fast and low. He hit the valley floor, 100 yards from the river, and didn't slow. The soldiers saw him, a single, ragged figure in hides, running toward them. "Indian," one of them yelled, raising his rifle. "Hold your fire," a sergeant bellowed, his eyes on the river. "My God, what's he doing?" Calder hit the edge of the ice, his moccasins giving him traction. He threw himself flat, spreading his weight, and shimmied across the cracking surface to the hole. He plunged his arm in, up to the shoulder, the cold a solid burning agony. His fingers locked onto the collar of the boy's coat. He hauled, his teeth grit, his back screaming. The boy was a dead weight. Calder got his head and shoulders out. The boy coughed, spewing icy water. Calder shoved him, hard, toward the solid bank. "Crawl!" he roared. The boy, sobbing with fear and cold, scrambled on all fours. The soldiers, their rifles forgotten, gaped at him. Calder pushed himself backward, off the groaning ice, and retreated. He didn't run, he just walked backward, his eyes on the sergeant, then melted back into the rocks. A profound, confused silence fell over the valley. The soldiers looked at the sputtering boy they were wrapping in blankets. They looked at their captain. Horace Mallory, who watched from his horse, his face a mask of thunder. Calder's act had done more damage than a volley of arrows. It had sown the one thing Mallory couldn't afford doubt. It had proven the savage was more human than the men who were paid to hunt him. Mallory knew he was losing control of the narrative. He spurred his horse, his voice a bellow of rage. "They're trying to divide us. A trick. The Western Ridge, I saw him. He came from the Western Ridge. Captain, take your squad, flank them." It was a mistake. Mallory had broken his own cardinal rule. He had let rage dictate his orders. "He sees us," Dakota said, his voice flat. "We go, now." They ran, leaping from rock to rock, heading for the deeper forest. But Mallory wasn't just sending a squad. He had seen his true target. This was a feint. A half-dozen of Kincaid's hired guns, men who moved with the silence of wolves, not soldiers, burst from a cleft in the rock behind them. They had been waiting. The siege, the soldier, all of it a trap to draw Dakota out. The fight was instant, brutal, and close. Asa and Eli met the charge, knives flashing. Dakota fired his rifle, the shot echoing. Calder drew his own, his father's old pepper box, its heavy weight clumsy in his hand. "Sania Ohan, run!" Dakota roared, clubbing his rifle against a charging man. But Sania wasn't running. She had her knife out, standing over Ohan, whose wounded arm made him a liability. Calder saw the man with the initials HM on his rifle stock the same one from the warehouse. He was ignoring the fight, his eyes fixed on Sania. He lunged, not to harm her, but to grab her. Calder fired his pistol. The shot went wide. The percussion cap's explosion deafening. The man stumbled, surprised, giving Sania a precious second. Then Mallory himself was there. He came from the side, on foot, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't bother with a weapon. He was a big man. He hit Dakota with his shoulder, sending the chief sprawling. He backhanded Calder, a blow that sent him crashing into the snow, his vision exploding in white stars. He grabbed Sania by her coat, lifting her off her feet. She kicked, her knife raking his arm. But he didn't flinch. With his other hand, he tore the skybone amulet from Dakota's neck, snapping the leather thong. "The promise breaker!" he roared, holding the amulet high for his men to see. "And the proof." He slung Sania over his shoulder. "Father!" she screamed. "Retreat!" Mallory bellowed. His men fired a volley into the rocks, forcing Dakota and Calder back. And then they were gone, vanishing down the slope with their prize. Silence. The fight had lasted less than a minute. Ohan was groaning. A new cut on his head. Asa, one of the scouts, was down, a dark stain spreading in the snow. Eli was checking him. The wound was bad. Dakota got to his feet. He was shaking, but not from cold. It was a rage so profound, so deep. It was a physical force. He let out a sound that was not human, a deep, guttural roar of a father who has seen his child stolen. "Signal Håkan!" he hissed, his voice trembling. "Signal the attack, all of him, every warrior. We burn that fort. I will tear his heart out." "No." Calder staggered to his feet, his jaw on fire. "Dakota. No, that's what he wants. That's the trap. He has my daughter," Dakota roared, shoving Calder so hard he fell again. "And he has the amulet," Calder shouted, scrambling back up, getting in the chief's face. "If you attack now, you prove him right, you declare war, every settler, every soldier will believe Kincaid's lie. They will hunt you to extinction. Sania will die for nothing. Kincaid wins. Don't you see? He wins." The words, raw and desperate, finally cut through the chief's rage. Dakota stopped, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, the fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, terrifying emptiness. He looked at Calder, his eyes hollow. "He has my Sania, and we're going to get her back," Calder said, his voice dropping, hard as iron. "Not your way, his way, through the cracks, through the lies." Eli, the remaining scout, dragged a figure from the bushes. It was one of Mallory's men, not one of Kincaid's. He was alive, his leg broken, a pistol in his hand. He was trying to crawl away. He was pale, sweating, and his face was familiar. Corporal Wrath, Mallory's dog. They dragged him back to a shallow cave as the first hard flakes of a new storm began to fall. By the time they lit a small, smokeless fire, the wind was howling. Wrath was terrified. He was a man of paper and errands, not a man of violence. Dakota, his face a mask of cold fury, simply began to heat his knife in the flames. He didn't say a word. "I don't know anything," Wrath whimpered, his eyes on the glowing metal. "Fort Pineglass," Calder said, his voice quiet. "You carry the messages. You took the packet." Wrath's eyes widened. "I just follow orders. He Kincaid." Dakota pressed the flat of the hot blade against the snow next to Wrath's face. It hissed, steam rising. "The fort. How does Kincaid get his whiskey in?" Wrath broke. "The tunnel, the old supply tunnel. From the first fort before the fire. It comes up from the riverbank right under the quartermaster's stores. They use it for private goods. Whiskey, furs, Kincaid's letters." "Draw it," Calder ordered. Wrath, his hands shaking, used a piece of charcoal from the fire to sketch a map on a flat rock. Dakota stood, his decision made. He was no longer a grieving father. He was a chief of war. "Eli, take Asa. Get him back to the high caves. Tell Håkon to make noise. Draw all of Mallory's men into the valley. Make them think we are trapped." He turned to Ohan, who was on his feet, his bad arm clutched to his chest. He looked at Calder. "Marla," Calder said. A new figure, wrapped in a heavy cloak, stepped from the shadows of the cave. She had returned. Her horse lathered. "The passes are sealed. Mallory's patrols are everywhere. The telegraph is out. I came back. This is the only way." "6 of us, then," Dakota said. "Me, Calder, Ohan, Eli. You will guide us back, then rejoin Håkon. That leaves 5, Marla said. "I know locks. I know his buildings. I'm coming." Dakota nodded. 5. Ohan stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. He looked at Calder. "I saw on the ice. You saved that blue coat. I have held poison in my heart for you. Calder Boone, I was jealous, and I was blind." He held out his good hand. "I am sorry. You are my brother. I will follow you into that tunnel." Calder gripped Ohan's hand, then pulled him into a brief, hard embrace. "We go as brothers." As they spoke, the storm hit. It was not a gentle snow. It was a sudden, violent blizzard, a wall of white that erased the world. The wind screamed, a furious elemental sound. "The mountain is angry," Ohan whispered. "No," Dakota said. His face turned to the gale. "The mountain hides us." Calder checked his father's pepper box. He had 2 shots left. He looked at the crude map. His father's name, on that poison paper, burned in his mind. But the rage was cold now, honed to a fine point. This wasn't just about his family's honor. It was about Sania's life. It was about rightful revenge. "Wrath said Mallory moves her at sunrise," Marla said, her voice tight. "He's taking her to Kincaid himself, to trade for God knows what. We have maybe 6 hours." Dakota kicked snow over the fire, plunging the cave into darkness. "Then we do not waste them." The 5 figures, small and dark against the raging white, moved out, swallowed instantly by the blizzard, heading for the riverbank in the hidden mouth of the fort. The tunnel was a black, frozen throat. The air was dead, heavy with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and the faint, sour tang of rodent nests. The blizzard's roar was instantly snuffed out, replaced by a suffocating, subterranean silence, broken only by the drip, drip of water seeping through the stone and the scrape of their own boots on the slick, uneven floor. Marla's shielded lantern cast a pathetic, greasy circle of light. Dakota led, his rifle held ready, his eyes scanning the oppressive dark. Calder was right behind him, followed by Marla, and finally Ohan, who brought up the rear, his good hand holding a knife, his face pale but set in a mask of rigid determination. They moved for what felt like an eternity. Then, High above them, a new sound. Rhythmic, heavy. Thud, thud, thud. Ohan froze, his eyes wide, looking up at the dripping ceiling. Sentry. Dakota breathed, not stopping. On the parapet. We are under the main wall. The sound was a terrifying reminder of the sleeping giant they were moving beneath. It vibrated through the earth, into the soles of their boots. The tunnel ended at a heavy, iron-strapped wooden door, slick with green mold. Dakota and Calder braced themselves, ready to splinter it. "No," Marla whispered, pushing past them. "That's my part." Ohan stood guard, his gaze fixed on the black tunnel behind them, while Marla worked. She didn't use the key. This was an internal lock, designed to be opened from the inside. She pulled 2 long, thin metal pins from her hair. They were her lockpicks. She knelt, inserting them, her ear pressed to the cold, damp wood. Calder held his breath, the only sound the faint scraped click of her picks. He heard the tumblers fall, one by one, with a final, dull thud. She turned the handle. The door opened with a low, aching groan. They were in. They emerged into a vast, cold darkness. The air was dry, smelling of canvas, cured salt, and hardtack. They were in the quartermaster's stores. Barrels of flour and salted pork were stacked to the ceiling, crates of rifles and ammunition, sacks of beans, and, just as Rath had promised, a rack of whiskey barrels marked SK. They moved like ghosts between the towering aisles. The fort was asleep, muffled by the raging blizzard. It was an unnatural quiet, the quiet of a powder keg before the spark. They passed the stores and entered a short hallway, lit by a single, low-burning lantern on a desk. A soldier was slumped in the chair, his head back, snoring, an empty bottle of Kincaid's whiskey on the floor by his boot. Dakota was on him before the man's next snore. He didn't harm him. His hand clamped over the soldier's mouth, a knife point pricking his throat. The soldier's eyes flew open in pure, drunken terror. Dakota simply put a finger to his own lips. He relieved the man of his pistol, then used the soldier's own belt and kerchief to bind and gag him, leaving him trussed in his chair. "The brig," Marla whispered, pointing to a door marked Detention. Dakota moved to the door. Ohan took his place in the hall, guarding their back. Calder, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, flanked his chief. Dakota kicked the door open. It was a small room with 3 cells. The first 2 were empty. In the third, she stood. Sania. She was not huddled on the cot. She was standing in the middle of the cell, her hands bound by a rope looped over a low-hanging ceiling beam, forcing her to stay upright. She was cold, her dress torn at the shoulder, her face smudged with dirt. But she was not broken. Her chin was up, her eyes blazing with a defiant, unquenchable fire. She saw her father, and her eyes widened. Then she saw Calder, right behind him. The fire in her eyes wavered, replaced by a sudden, brilliant, impossible wave of relief. Calder didn't wait. He crossed the room in one step. His knife flashed, a single upward stroke, severing the rope. She fell. He caught her, his arms locking around her, pulling her against his chest with a force that crushed the air from both of them. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of smoke and the cold, clean scent of the blizzard. He was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. He had been so sure he was too late. He felt her arms wrap around his back, her fingers clutching his coat, holding on as if he were the only solid thing on earth. He pulled back, his hands framing her face. He saw the tracks of tears on her dirty cheeks, but she was not crying now. His lips found hers. It was not the slow, tender kiss of the campfire. It was a desperate, shaking, frantic collision. A kiss of pure, raw affirmation. "You are alive. I am here. We are real." He tasted the salt of her tears, and a single, hot tear of his own escaped, burning a scalding track down his frozen cheek. She pulled back, her forehead resting against his, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "I kept the promise," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I stayed steadfast." His own voice was a thick, raw thing he didn't recognize. "So did I." We move. Dakota's voice was a blade, cutting through the moment. His face was a mask of pained, urgent love. He handed his daughter his own knife. Ohan, the door! Let no one pass. Ohan nodded, his face grim. As the mountain, he vowed, taking his position in the outer hallway, guarding the only entrance. Marla, Calder, the office, now. Dakota commanded. Mallory's office was adjacent to the brig. This lock was different. Heavy, brass, and military. He was in a hurry, Marla muttered, studying it. He just used the standard, stupid. Her picks went to work. With a sharp click, the door swung open. The room was heavy with the smell of stale cigar smoke, old leather, and Kincaid's whiskey. It was the smell of corrupt power. Dakota didn't hesitate. He swept the lamp from the desk, sending it crashing, and began to tear the drawers out, dumping their contents. Calder went straight for a tall, locked cabinet. He didn't wait for Marla. He jammed the barrel of his father's pistol against the lock and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. A cannon shot in the small room. Wood and metal splintered. Inside, sitting on a shelf, was a metal dispatch box, stamped with the Kincaid Railland Company logo. Calder tore it out, smashing the simple hasp on the corner of the desk. The poison, Dakota, Sania, and Marla gathered as he dumped the contents. It was all there. The map, Sania breathed, snatching the familiar, rolled parchment, the annexation proposal. But this one was signed in black ink by Kincaid and countersigned in blue by Horace Mallory. The payments, Marla said, sifting through receipts. Payments to the security unit. $400, $500, $1,000. It's all here. Calder held up the last sheaf of letters. He read the top one, his voice a low, shaking growl. My dear Captain, you will proceed with the controlled incident at Thistle Creek at your earliest convenience. Payment is contingent on a swift military response. Blame must be firmly and publicly placed on the tawny agitators. Your cooperation will ensure. Give me that, me. Dakota snatched the letters, his eyes blazing. He shoved the papers, the map, all of it, back into the dispatch box. He saw something else on the desk, glinting in the lantern light from the hall. The Skybone amulet. Mallory had left it there. A trophy, with a reverence that was almost violent. Dakota seized the amulet, his hands shaking, and secured the broken thong back around his own neck. Ohan, we are done! Sentry! Ohan's voice was a sharp, panicked hiss from the hall. New guard he's seen. A heavy boot scraped on the floorboards. A new soldier, come to relieve the first, rounded the corner. He saw the bound man in the chair. He saw Ohan in the hallway. The soldier didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle to his shoulder and fired it straight at the ceiling. Bang! The shot was followed by the one sound that meant the end. A bugle. A frantic, piercing, chaotic call that was not reveille, but the alarm. To arms, the fort exploded. Heavy boots hit the floorboards above them. Shouts. The clang of metal. Now, Dakota roared. Out the way we came. No, Marla screamed. The courtyard. It's the only way they'll block the tunnel. Dakota made the choice. The courtyard, go. Ohan led the way. Throwing the hall door open, they spilled out into the open square. The blizzard was a godsend. It was a churning, white chaos. Men were running from the barracks, half-dressed, colliding with each other in the driving snow. Lanterns swung wildly, casting frantic, distorted shadows. There, in the open, a voice roared from the parapet. A volley of shots erupted. Ping wine-crack bullets snapped through the air, kicking up puffs of snow, splintering the wooden boardwalks. Calder saw Sania, her form stark against the white. She was exposed. Sania, down, he yelled. He didn't wait. He hit her with his full weight, a flying tackle that sent them both sprawling behind a large, frozen sand barrel used for fires. A millisecond later, a bullet thudded into the wood, exactly where she had been standing. They were pinned. 10 soldiers were forming a line between them and the main gate. Dakota snarled. He reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled out 2 small, tightly wrapped leather packets. His own invention. Dried tobacco leaves, sulfur, and a pinch of powder. He sparked his flint, lit the short, sputtering fuses, and threw them. The packets landed in the snow at the soldier's feet. They did not explode. They erupted. A whoosh of thick, acrid, choking brown smoke billowed outward, instantly enveloping the firing line in a fog so dense it blotted out the lanterns. Coughing, yelling, cursing. "Now!" Dakota bellowed, pulling Marla. "To the gate!" Calder grabbed Sania's hand. "Run! Don't look back!" They plunged into the smoke cloud. A soldier loomed out of the fog. His bayonet level, Ohan, with a roar, slammed into him with his good shoulder, sending the man crashing. They burst through the smoke, through the swirl of the blizzard. The main gate was pandemonium. The sentries were trying to see, blinded by the snow and the smoke. Calder, Dakota, Ohan, Sania, and Marla burst through them like a freight train. A knot of desperate shadows. They were out. They were free. They plunged into the deep, welcoming drifts outside the fort walls, the storm swallowing them whole. A last parting shot. From the parapet, a lone gunman, firing into the white. Calder grunted. A sudden, searing pain burning across his left shoulder. It felt like a hot iron. He stumbled but did not fall, pulled forward by Sania's hand. They ran. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs were numb, finally collapsing in a pine-choked gully a quarter-mile from the fort, where Eli had left their horses. Calder sagged against a tree, the metal dispatch box clutched in his hand, his breath sawing in his chest. "You're bleeding," Sania said, her voice sharp with a new fear. He looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the shoulder of his coat. "It's a graze, just a graze." "It is not just a graze," she said, her voice trembling. She tore a long strip of cloth from her underskirt. Her hands were shaking, but her touch was sure. She packed the wound, a deep, angry furrow that had missed the bone by an inch. She bound it, pulling the knot brutally tight. He shivered, the cold and the shock finally hitting him. She finished the bandage. Her hands lingered, warm, on his cold, wet coat. The blizzard swirled around them, muffling the world, creating a tiny, private pocket of silence. She stepped closer, pressing her forehead against his, her hands coming up to cup his face, her thumbs rubbing warmth back into his frozen skin. "When this is done," she whispered, her voice fierce, "when the peace comes, I promise you a peaceful night. A night with no running, no fear, I promise." He closed his eyes, leaning into her strength. "I'm holding you to that," he breathed. A sound in the trees. Dakota raised his rifle. "It is Eli," a voice called. The scout appeared, his face grim. "Mallory is in full pursuit of Hawkan, deep in Stonevale. He thinks he has our people trapped." As he spoke, a distant, frantic sound came from the fort behind them. The bugle, not the alarm call, but the recall, frantic, repeated. Ohan, leaning against a tree, gave a low, painful laugh. He has found his fort tipped over. He will be angry. The fury of Mallory's pursuit would be relentless now. Marla, gasping for breath, slid from her horse. "It's done." "What is?" Dakota asked, securing the precious box. "The telegraph. Before I rode back, the storm was just hitting the passes, but the line was still up." "I got the message out," she panted. 2 reporters, from the Denver Tribune, and I sent a 3rd message, to Federal Commissioner Whitlock. He's an honest man, and he hates Kincaid. She looked up, her eyes wild in the faint light. "If the storm doesn't stop them, they'll be on the noon stage tomorrow, looking for a war, or a story." Dakota looked at the metal box. He looked at the raging blizzard. "Good, then we will give them one. We ride, not to hide. We ride to Thistle Creek. We will have our trial in the street." The blizzard had broken at dawn, leaving Thistle Creek in a state of unnatural, muffled silence. The world was buried, the sky a bruised, exhausted gray, but the town was not asleep. In the main street, In front of the small, clapboard courthouse, a platform had been hastily shoveled clear. Silas Kincaid stood on the steps, his fine wool suit impeccable, his face a mask of civic concern. A few of his hired guns, looking more like vigilantes than guards, stood with him. He was addressing a small, shivering crowd of about 30 townsfolk. Friends, neighbors. Kincaid's voice was smooth, resonant, and full of false sympathy. We have suffered a terrible night, an assault by lawless forces, while our brave Captain Mallory chases them into the hills. We must secure our homes. I am therefore establishing a community security fund to protect our property, our families. He was turning the chaos into profit, using the fear he had manufactured to perform a public shakedown. He was, in effect, washing his stolen money in plain sight. At the far end of the steps, standing alone, was Calder Boone. He didn't look at Kincaid. He didn't look at the crowd. He was leaning against the wall of a small, one-room cabin next to the courthouse, a hut the town kept for holding witnesses or the occasional overnight prisoner. He was wearing his same ragged canvas coat, his shoulders stiff with the bandage beneath it. In his hands, he held the metal dispatch box. He was a single, silent, defiant counterpoint to Kincaid's performance. Kincaid's eyes flickered to him, annoyed by the distraction. A vagrant, a troublemaker, as you all saw from the wanted poster. Mr. Kincaid. The voice cut through the street. It was Marla Voss. She was walking from her saloon, her face pale but her eyes on fire. Two men, bundled in heavy city coats, were with her. One was setting up a small, strange-looking metal device on a tripod, a typewriter. The other was scribbling in a notepad. The reporters had arrived. Kincaid's composure faltered. Mrs. Voss, this is a private. He was interrupted, not by a voice, but by a sound, a soft, rhythmic crunch of many feet on new snow. They came from the north end of town, where the canyon opened. Not Hawkins' war party, but the entire contingent of tawny warriors. 30 of them. They were not painted for war. They were not shouting. They were on foot, their faces grim and resolute, their lances held upright. The crowd gasped, the settlers falling back, hands reaching for pistols. But the warriors did not stop at the platform. They walked past Kincaid, their expressions blank, as if he were not there. They continued down the street until they reached the small cabin where Calder stood, and there they stopped. In a single, fluid, practiced movement, they formed a perfect, silent line, 30 warriors, shoulder to shoulder, standing in the snow. They created a living, breathing wall in front of the small cabin, their bodies a shield, their presence an undeniable warning. They were not here to attack. They were here to protect their witness. A new figure appeared, pushing through the back of the crowd, Commissioner E. Whitlock. He was a lean, hard man in a simple black coat, his beard trimmed, his eyes missing nothing. He looked at Kincaid, at the reporters, at Calder, and at the wall of tawny. He simply nodded, once, and took a position where he could see everything. The street was as silent as a church. Marla Voss stepped onto the platform. She was holding the heavy, water-damaged ledger. Silas Kincaid, you call for a security fund. Her voice rang out, clear and shaking with anger. But this book, this ledger, stolen from your own warehouse, says the only person we need security from is you. It lists a payment of $500 to an anonymous security unit, dated 3 days ago, the day the depot was burned. A gasp went through the crowd. Kincaid's face paled, but he forced a smile. Marla, you're distraught. That book means nothing. A fabrication. Then what of this? Dakota's voice. He walked through the center of his warriors. Who parted for him? Sania and Ohan were at his side. He stepped onto the platform, his gaze finding not Kincaid, but Captain Horace Mallory, who had just ridden into town from the south, his uniform filthy, his face black with rage from the failed pursuit. Dakota held up the sky-bone amulet, its pale crescent gleaming in the gray light. The winter promise. Dakota declared, his voice echoing, an oath of peace, An oath you, Captain Mallory, swore to uphold, but you betrayed it. You betrayed your uniform. You betrayed the people of this valley, all for his profit. Lies, Mallory roared, dismounting, his hand on his pistol. Slander, this savage, he's the one who— And what about this, Captain? Calder's voice. He stepped forward, leaving the protection of the warrior line. He walked onto the platform, dispatch box in hand. He opened it. He took out the sheaf of letters. "Is this your signature?" he asked. His voice quiet, but it carried in the dead still air. He held up the letter. "My dear Captain, you will proceed with the controlled incident at Thistle Creek. Blame must be firmly placed on the Tawny agitators." Calder looked at Kincaid, then back at Mallory, and he held up the annexation map. 2 signatures. One on the order to burn the depot, one on the map to steal the land, and they match. It was a fatal, perfect blow. The link was made. The reporters were scribbling, one man already typing. The clack, clack, clack of the machine, the only sound. Mallory snapped. His training, his career, his entire life, dissolved in a single second of pure, murderous rage. He was a ruined man. He tore his pistol from its holster, leveling it, not at Dakota, but at Calder, the source of his humiliation. "You!" Sania screamed. "Calder!" Ohan moved. His arm was in a sling, his body wounded, but his honor was intact. He didn't have time to stop the draw. He threw himself forward, slamming his one good shoulder into Mallory's arm. Just as the captain fired. Crack! The shot was deafening. The bullet went high, striking the painted wooden sign above the courthouse door. The word "Justice" splintered, a chunk of wood flying off. In that frozen moment of shock, Kincaid made his move. He wasn't a fighter, he was a coward. He shoved a townsman aside, his eyes on his horse, his bodyguard drawing a long, wicked-looking Bowie knife to clear a path. But Sania was closer. She had been standing by her father, a shadow. As the bodyguard raised his knife, she moved. It was not a punch. It was a fluid, precise dance. She stepped inside his guard, her hand a blur, locking onto his wrist. She used his own forward momentum, twisting, a move that sent a white-hot spike of pain up his arm. His fingers, trained to fight, spasmed open. The knife clattered to the boardwalk. Before the man could even register the pain, Sania had spun away, back to her father's side, her hand now resting on the hilt of her own knife. She had disarmed him in less than a second. That was the moment the town turned. The young soldier, the one Calder had pulled from the icy river, had been standing in the crowd, his rifle at ease. Now, his face rigid with a terrible, dawning clarity. He raised his rifle. He didn't aim it at the Tawny. He aimed it directly at his commanding officer, Captain Horace Mallory. "Sir!" The boy's voice cracked. "Drop your weapon." A dozen other townsfolk, men who had been miners, trappers, even a few of Mallory's own soldiers, followed his lead. The street was suddenly filled with the sound of rifle hammers being cocked. The sound was a final judgment. Commissioner Whitlock stepped onto the platform. He looked at the shattered sign. He looked at the guns. He looked at Kincaid, who was frozen in place. "Captain Horace Mallory." Whitlock's voice was cold iron. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, sedition, and high crimes against the laws of this territory." He then turned his gaze on Silas Kincaid. "Mr. Kincaid, your bodyguard will be detained for assault. And your assets, your claims, your land company, and this security fund are hereby frozen by federal authority, pending a full investigation into your criminal conspiracy." Kincaid looked at the rifles pointed at him, at the wall of silent warriors, at the scribbling reporters. For the first time, his smooth, confident mask dissolved, revealing the sniveling, craven man beneath. He was beaten. A single Tawny drum began to beat, a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a heart, steady and strong, a heart that had been here long before Kincaid, and would be here long after. The snow, which had held off, began to fall again, not a blizzard, but soft, clean, white flakes. They fell on the soldiers, on the settlers, On the warriors. They fell on the splintered sign, and on the useless, discarded knife. The street was silent, save for the drum. The truth had finally spoken. The end came not with a gunshot, but with the clack, clack, clack of a telegraph key. Silas Kincaid, his fine wool suit now smeared with the grime of the street, was marched by two grim-faced federal marshals to the Thistle Creek station. His hands were bound in iron. Captain Horace Mallory, stripped of his insignia, his face a hollow mask of ruin, was marched behind him. The reporter from the Denver Tribune, his face alight with the story of a lifetime, was already at the telegraph, the key chattering, sending the poison paper truths across the wires. Kincaid arrested conspiracy to incite war, federal fraud, land seizure, the paper war. The one Ayanna Snowthistle had known they must fight was being won. Back on the steps of the courthouse, Commissioner Whitlock, the dispatch box in his hand, unrolled the map. He held it up for the silent crowd, tawny, settler, and soldier, standing shoulder to shoulder in the cleansing snow. By the authority of the federal territory, Whitlock announced, his voice carrying in the cold, clear air. This document, this lie is nullified. The land it describes, he looked directly at Dakota, is hereby recognized as the Promise Corridor, a sovereign passage for the Tawny people, protected by federal law. Any military passage through this land must, from this day forward, be by invitation only. A low, profound sound of relief and joy rumbled through the Tawny warriors. It was the sound of a people who, for the first time, had not lost. Whitlock was not finished. He pulled another document from the box, the crumpled, water-stained debt list. Furthermore, he said, his eyes finding Calder, the investigation has found that the foreclosures enacted by the Kincaid Land Company are fraudulent. The debts, including the one held against Ezekiel Boone, Calder's breath hitched, are declared void. The title for the Boone farmstead is restored, its debts canceled, its name cleared from this false ledger. It was done. His father's name, his mother's honor. It was not a vengeance of blood and ash, but of truth. The poison paper had been burned by the light. Dakota stepped forward. He held the skybone amulet, its leather thong freshly mended. He did not put it on. He walked to Calder, who stood, shaking, his shoulder aching, his mind reeling. Dakota took Calder's hand. He pressed the cold, sacred bone into Calder's palm. You came to these mountains as a drifter, Dakota said, his voice thick with an emotion Calder had never heard from him. You came with nothing, a ghost white, but you saved my blood. You fought for my people. You are Talahoni, our long journey brother, and you are the keeper of the path. He closed Calder's fingers around the amulet. From this day, you are no longer homeless. The mountains recognize you. Calder Boone, this is your home. That night, the celebration fire in the falling snow camp was visible from the highest peaks. The drum beat, not with the slow pace of healing, but with the rapid, joyous rhythm of victory. Ohan, his arm bound, was dancing, as was Marla, who had been brought to the camp as an honored guest. Calder and Sania stood by the fire, their hands linked, watching the celebration. The promise of the valley had been kept. The promise of a future was just beginning. After a time, she leaned her head on his good shoulder. The night is peaceful, she whispered. Almost, he replied. She led him away from the light, away from the sounds of the drum, to a warm lodge set apart, prepared for them, the hides thick and new. Inside, a low fire burned, casting a soft, golden light. The air was warm, smelling of pine and smoked leather. He pulled her to him, his hands gentle. The urgency of the fort, the desperation of the chase, was gone. This was slow. This was safe. Their breathing slowed, finding the same rhythm. His rough hand, scarred by traps and ropes, came up to cup her face. He kissed her, a deep, slow kiss that was not a question, but an answer. It was a promise kept. I am holding you to your word. He murmured against her lips, a peaceful night. "The peace is here," she whispered back. His heavy canvas coat, the one he had worn as a drifter, the symbol of his rootless, lonely life, slid from his shoulders, aided by her hands, and fell to the fur-lined floor. He looked at her, his gaze full of a profound, quiet awe. She was here. She was safe. She met his gaze, her own full of trust, of a deep and certain knowledge. Her hands rested on his chest, over his heart. He placed his own over hers. They stood like that, in the warm silence, simply listening to the sound of each other's breath. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "Sania," he whispered, a confirmation. "Is this?" She stopped his words with a gentle finger to his lips. "Yes," she breathed. "It is." The firelight cast their two shadows against the hide wall, dancing. And then, as they moved closer, the two shadows merged, becoming one in the soft, fading light. At dawn, the 30 warriors stood waiting. They were not at his door this time. They were lined along the banks of the river, near the small bridge called the Twilight Wood. They were not a threat. They were an honor guard. As Calder and Sania approached, the warriors raised their lances as one, a silent, glittering salute. Ohan stepped forward. The jealousy and suspicion were long gone, burned away by the river and the fire. In his good hand, he held a knife, its handle carved from antler, its sheath beaded by his sister. "Talahoni," Ohan said, his voice proud. He offered the knife. Calder took it. He saw a single word carved into the antler. "Noka," the courage of the dark, Calder said, his voice thick. "No," Ohan said, smiling. "It means brother. We were forged in the storm. We are brothers now." Calder pulled him into a hard, one-armed embrace. They rode in Thistle Creek. Marla Voss stood on the porch of the railhead, watching the last of the federal wagons pull out. She swept the porch, the town hers again. As she moved a chair, she saw it a small, folded piece of paper. She opened it. There was no name, just 3 words, in a rough, scrawled hand. "Thank you. The miners." She smiled, a small, tired, satisfied smile, and tucked the note into her apron. Cal Gelder reined in his horse on the last ridge, the one overlooking the Ashwind Range. The peaks were sharp and clean against the morning sky. He was looking at it for the last time as a drifter, as an outcast. He was no longer running. He was a man returned. He turned to Sania, who rode beside him. He reached out, his hand finding hers. "It will be a hard winter," he said. "It always is," she replied, her eyes bright. "We should start building our winter lodge," he said, his voice quiet. "Together," she smiled. "A promise of 1,000 nights." "Yes, together." As they looked out, a new sound echoed up from the valley. A single, clear bugle call from the fort. It was not an alarm. It was a formal, military acknowledgement. Eli, the scout, who had ridden up to join them, listened, his head cocked. "It is done," Eli confirmed. "The telegraph just confirmed. Kincaid is on the eastbound train, in Irons. He is gone." A sound started in the falling snow camp, a sound of pure, unbridled joy. A roar. It was echoed, faintly, by shouts from the town of Thistle Creek. The valley was free. Calder looked at Sania. The wind picked up, whipping her hair, the red thread of his promise bright on his wrist. He pulled her horse closer, leaning across the saddle. He drew her in, and together they raised the sky-bone amulet, its pale crescent held high against the clean, cold sky. He kissed her, a long, triumphant kiss, as the cheering echoed up from the valley below, and the world, for the first time, was finally at peace. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments, share your thoughts, and connect with fellow fans. Please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850 give this video a like, and if you enjoyed the tale, please support us by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.